السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. كيف حالكم شيخ إسماعيل? Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it's not very clear.
Just a second.
Yeah, I think maybe you need the other mic.
How about now?
It's better. It's better, but don't you have a
now
separate mic?
How about now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay, but there's some phone going off or something in the background.
Does this work?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is good.
Okay, great.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our second session discussing the future of Ijtihad. This is a follow-up session from our previous session. Obviously, in our previous session, we talked about a lot of things, but obviously we really, just scratching the surface on various issues. And, again, anything short of a full lengthy series on this is not going to be able to do it justice. In fact, a lecture series would not be able to do a topic of this magnitude justice in any case. So, again, we're just going to be trying to highlight certain points for discussion, and it's hoped that by doing so that that for our audience, whether general Muslims and also in particular Tulab al-Ilm, to help move the discussion forward and to create discussion, and maybe also give some food for thought that in terms of the issues that Tulab al-Ilm need to be pondering, which of course includes ourselves, that we should be pondering over in terms of what is really the future of fiqh, what is the future of ijtihad. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Sheikh Ismail. I believe there was something you wanted to share to begin.
So, just as an entry point into our discussion today, which is indeed a follow-up from last week's discussion, is what relevance Ijtihad has in the modern era. And a lot of people, due to a variety of factors, are quite averse to the term due to various happenings that we identified in the previous session, not only in the past 150 years, but also beyond that, as to why scholars were cautious as to whether this term should be even used or appropriated, or people should be even identified as mujtahids, even though, as we clearly identified, that a lot of scholars across the centuries of Islam have engaged in the activity of ijtihad. Now, engaging in the activity of ijtihad, and that's one thing, and the other thing is to correctly identify that those acts and those engagements in knowledge as ijtihad is another factor, which, due to various circumstances, whether social, whether political, whether intellectual, or even financial, as we identified, those were not considered to be ijtihad, even though they were doing ijtihad. So I mentioned last week that Sheikh Mustafa Zarqa, in a paper he wrote, which is published in the Islamabad University's journal in the 1980s, stated that towards the end of the Ottoman Khilafah, amongst the many things that were happening in the run-up of the fall in 1924, one of the things that happened was that the term ijtihad became so toxic that anyone who claimed to have undertaken ijtihad, let alone claiming to be a mujtahid, anyone who claimed to have undertaken ijtihad in any particular issue would, in his words, would be executed. Regardless of the veracity of that or not, what we can clearly see, or what we can clearly appreciate at that time, was that the status of scholarship in the Muslim world, although it was flourishing in other aspects, but in this particular issue of ijtihad in fiqh, or identifying acts of ijtihad in fiqh as ijtihad, was clearly something that was suppressed. And what negative impact did that have on the ummah? He says that after the fall of the Khilafah, when the Muslims needed real-time solutions to lift the ummah back from the quagmire it found itself in, the ummah simply didn't have the expertise or intellectual flexibilities or capabilities to come up with the solutions in order to respond immediately to the downfall of the Khilafah. And what impact did that have? The Western nations, Europe and America, took the lead in the world, whereas the Muslim populace, mainly Muslim countries across the world, they fell behind. So in response to that, slowly but surely, the majami' fiqhiyya developed. And what the majami' fiqhiyya did, and there are several of them dotted across the world. Some are specific to specific countries, like those in India and Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. Some are supranational, some are regional. But the idea behind that is to come up with solutions for pressing issues which in fiqh are identified as nawazil, that would enable Muslims to live a normal life in the 20th century and now the 21st century, without having to hark back to old fiqh models, where those solutions were simply not present. So even though there's a certain reliance upon precedents, but still, when it comes to nawazil mutajaddi, the new upcoming issues, scholars identified the need to get together in these various majami' fiqhiyya and to come up with the solutions that are required. Now, the discussions on majami' fiqhiyya, or the discussions on al-ijtihad fil asr al-hadir, ijtihad in the modern era, is not something that's new. It's not something that we just invented in this session. It's been something that's been going on for almost a century now. Immediately after the fall of the Khilafah, or soon thereafter, discussions on the need for majami' fiqhiyya where ijtihad will be exercised started to happen. And in a paper, the respected Mufti Taqi Usmani of Pakistan, he wrote a paper which was presented at a conference in Algeria in 1983, and this is published in his Maqalat al-Uthmani, and it's entitled Manhajiyatul Ijtihad fil Asr al-Hadir. And the reason why I mentioned Mufti Taqi is because he is considered to be on the more cautious side of the spectrum when it comes to ijtihad. So because every scholar has his or her own methodology when it comes to ijtihad, whether they want to engage in ijtihad in all issues that have already been discussed and they want to come up with their own tarjih, or in their own opinion in masail such as salah or hajj, or old issues. And then there's ijtihad in new issues, which are nawazil, which everybody would agree that it's like a fard kifaya, is a communal obligation on the ummah. So Mufti Taqi tends to focus his ijtihadat on new issues and doesn't really delve into old issues. But the opportunity to ijtihad in old issues is still there. It's not something that's ever been taken away. And this is something we clearly see within the scholars of all four madhahib and beyond, that they engaged in ijtihadat that went against sometimes their respective madhahib, and even they engaged in ijtihad in a manner that led them back to their respective madhahib. So when we see scholars agreeing with their madhab, that doesn't necessarily mean they are doing taqlid of their madhab, but rather they might be agreeing with their respective madhahib via the process of ijtihad. And just to go off on a tangent, there is an article by Mufti Taha Karan of Cape Town in South Africa, and we covered his article in the course because it is one of the best articles I've ever seen when it comes to the identifying what constitutes ijtihad. And And he gave the example of Taqiyuddin al-Subki, the contemporary of Ibn Taymiyyah, the father of Tajuddin al-Subki, the author of Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya al-Kubra, the famous Taqiyuddin al-Subki. So Taqiyuddin al-Subki, Sheikh Taha Karan writes, is that in 50 or so issues, he disagreed with the Shafi'i madhab. Does that mean in everything else he was doing taqlid of Imam al-Shafi'i or the Shafi'i scholars before him? No. 50 or so issues, he agreed with the Shafi'i school. He disagreed with the Shafi'i school, which naturally were via his own ijtihad. That does not mean in the rest of the body of fiqh he was doing taqlid of the Shafi'i school or the Shafi'i scholars that were previous to him, but rather it is highly possible or highly likely that he agreed with his Shafi'i school by the process of ijtihad. So ijtihad doesn't mean that one has to disagree with the madhab he or she grew up on. Okay, so that's just to highlight that the Subkis were in the 8th century. So that's 600th century.
And you know, it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned that about a Subki. I mean, if this is true of a Subki, then you know, that's would certainly not be surprising if you consider that that Imam Malik is by agreement a Mujtahid Mutlaq. He's one of the 4 Imams. That is that are reference points in fiqh matters, and very clearly he was operating within the existing fiqh tradition of Medina. Likewise, we see with Imam Abu Hanifa, who is by agreement Mujtahid Mutlaq, one of the 4 Imams, was operating within the Kufan tradition, and particularly the Kufan tradition as expressed by Ibrahim al-Nakhai, and yet we find that Malik has his own ijtihad, of course. Abu Hanifa has his own ijtihad, and even in his ijtihad, he might sometimes go outside of the views of the Kufans. And the fact that his fiqh is largely built on Kufan fiqh doesn't mean that he's simply just doing taqlid of Ibn Mas'ud, Ali, Ibrahim al-Nakhai, and Hamad, for example. There is a process of ijtihad involved, but at the same time, he is also inherited a certain fiqh tradition. So it's not surprising then that that by a Subki's time, when these madhahib are so much more established, the tradition is more fixed, that it's natural that that a scholar exercising ijtihad would feel affinity to the tradition that he grew up with, that he mastered. And then also, yes, he had, in the process of making ijtihad, sometimes his ijtihad takes him outside of the madhab, but that doesn't mean that simply he's agreeing with the madhab entirely out of taqlid. And so if we see that with Abu Hanifa, then how much more so with a Subki or any other scholar who, after the period of the early Imams who actually gained the ability to do ijtihad, it's natural that we would find that they're not, being a mujtahid doesn't mean that you're going to just invent things and bring them out from left field, because at the end of the day, you're looking at the same sharia that all of the other mujtahid before you were looking at. So and I think this actually speaks to, I'm sorry for cutting you off, but this actually speaks to one of the concerns that so many people have about ijtihad, is that if we leave the door, we talked about this last week, that the door is not really open, it's broken now, but that if we open the door to ijtihad, that it will open the door for people to say all kinds of crazy stuff. And in a certain sense, there's an element of truth to that. We find ourselves in a time that people are saying all kinds of crazy stuff, but that doesn't mean that that's what ijtihad is. And that is what is going to be a natural consequence of scholars practicing ijtihad. I mean, quite the contrary. You could actually say a case could be made that much of the chaos that you see is due to a lack of ijtihad. That it sort of has left the field wide open for juhal and half pseudo scholars to fill that void, and then they make and then you get all this chaos. So back to what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the vacuum that was left that was filled
Yeah,
in by
absolutely.
people who find more expeditious methods to come up with their own views, and especially in today's era, that effect has been amplified. But just to go back to the issue of the four Imams, many of the Ijtihadat activities, I believe, have not been encapsulated in the Ijtihad taxonomies that were developed later on. I mean, forget the tabaqat of the Mujtahideen. I'm talking about the
Right.
types of Ijtihad a Mujtahid would undertake. So, for
The
example,
types of Ijtihad.
yeah. So, if Imam Abu Hanifa is looking solely at the Kufan tradition in his time, or for the large part, obviously he was aware of what's going on in other regions, but his focus was on the Kufan tradition, and likewise Imam Malik in Medina. And this was before the person-based madhahib were really developed with the advent of Imam Shafi'i, who amalgamated the various regional schools into a particular school that was identified after a particular scholar like Shafi'i himself. But in Malik's time, it was pretty much identified as the school of Medina, and in the case of Abu Hanifa, it was still the Madhab Ahl al-Kufa or Madhab Ahl al-Iraq. So when Imam Malik or Imam Abu Hanifa are engaging in the tradition of their respective madhahib, are they doing ijtihad? Is Imam Malik doing is Imam Malik and Imam Hanifa, are they doing ijtihad, or are they doing taqlid of the fuqaha sab'a of Medina or Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, for example? It's not that clear that in every single issue they were doing taqlid 100% of Ibrahim al-Nakha'i in the case of Abu Hanifa, or in the case of Imam Malik is doing taqlid of Rabi'atul Ra'i or the fuqaha sab'a like Sa'id al-Musayyib and Sulaiman ibn Yasar. They did have an awareness of evidences, no doubt. Were they aware or critically engaging with the evidences of opinions on the opposite side, which they may or may not have been aware of? And does that have an impact on whether we conceptualize their activities as ijtihad or not? Because ijtihad, as developed in later eras, is, as we see in the usul text, ijtihad means you look at the evidence on your side, and you also look at the evidences on the other side, which you disagree with. Then you come up with a conclusion or your own opinion. Were they really aware of the evidences that were being employed in, for example, the Hijaz in the case of Abu Hanifa? Obviously, he went to Hijaz where we know that he went for Hajj numerous times, and he had interactions with Malik and Ata in Makkah, even stayed in Makkah for a few years. But does that mean that he was aware of all the evidences that were being used on the other side in every single matter? That's a very hard claim to make. So in those particular issues where he would have been aware of his own evidences, but not necessarily the evidences of the opinions that were in vogue in other regions, how do we identify his scholarly activity in those matters? Is he doing taqlid of his Kufan tradition, or is he doing ijtihad? If it's ijtihad, how can we call that ijtihad if it's not fully encompass the evidences of the side opposite? So it's a matter of conceptualization, and it's not something that's been captured, I believe, in later ijtihad or taqlid taxonomies.
Yeah, this raises an interesting question, because obviously we think about this more in terms of when we look at later scholars, we look at that there's actually different types of ijtihad. So you have ijtihad mutlaq, where someone is actually engaging the nusus and making ijtihad. You have ijtihad where a person is looking at the aqwal and is looking at the adilla based on it, but these adilla and these aqwal and these istidlalat are actually aqwal and adilla and istidlalat of scholars who preceded him. They're not on istinbat, and then he's simply choosing between them. And then you have ijtihad in terms of various types of tahrir in the madhab, takhrij in the madhab, but we sort of lose sight of the fact that when we look at the four imams, for example, they were not actually operating with sort of like what you would call a clean slate. In fact, nobody was. There's not any person that you can point to and say that this person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed him on the earth to be a mujtahid mutlaq. And so, he amalgamated all of the raw nusus of the Quran and the Sunnah, and unaffected by the ijtihad of anyone else, did istinbat from it. Because obviously that's just absurd. But I think, removed now over 1,000 years from the the actual time period in which these Imams lived. I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the historical context in which they operated, and obviously as Muslims, we all have great amount of reverence and immense respect for these Imams, which they're absolutely deserving of. But that immense respect, sometimes, when it's not coupled with a proper understanding of the historical context, can lead to a sort of exaggeration. Meaning, and again, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. No one, please, I'm not suggesting that someone could come afterwards and be, greater than Imam Malik or greater than Abu Hanifa. This is, just if anyone actually has those thoughts, they don't belong in a discussion on Ijtihad.
The fact that you're making these disclaimers just demonstrate how entrenched certain misconceptions.
Exactly.
So unlearn, I believe, a lot of things that is mentioned in books of polemics, particularly.
Yeah. So there's this notion of the Mujtahid Mutlaq. Mujtahid Mutlaq is someone who has looked at first, before he's even looked at the issues of fiqh, he's looked at all of the issues of usul al-fiqh, and he has done ijtihad and derived his own usul. Then he's looked at all of the issues of furu', with all of the evidences, with all of the alat that requires, all of the tools that requires, and has done ijtihad in all of those issues. I'm not saying that the four Imams are not mujtahid. I mean, this is interesting. I recall coming across some contemporary author. I don't want to misquote anyone, so I'm not going to mention a name because I don't remember offhand who it was. Was debating. It was a paper about the history of the Hanafi Madhab, and he took exception to what Shah Waliullah Dahlawi had to say about Imam Abu Hanifa. That he in one place, this other in Al-Insaf, he in describing the activities of Imam Abu Hanifa, he said that basically he was doing takhrij on the fiqh of Ibrahim al-Nakhai. And so obviously he and others have taken great exception to that. How can you say that Abu Hanifa is doing takhrij on the madhab of Ibrahim? Abu Hanifa is a mujtahid mutlaq. And I agree, Abu Hanifa is a mujtahid mutlaq. But the irony is that they said that, but in the process of responding to this, and I think he was quoting others who had already responded to this before him. And so he had sort of compiled these discussions. And in responding to this, he says, Fulana said this and Fulana said this. And look here, even Shah Waliullah has contradicted himself because he himself has described Abu Hanifa as a mujtahid mutlaq. So maybe another way of understanding it is that actually Shah Waliullah actually has a very different conception of what it means for Abu Hanifa to be a mujtahid mutlaq than what you have in mind. And so maybe there is no contradiction. And I think this actually brings up a very important point. And this is important also for answering some of the concerns that people had concerning the last lecture. I think one of the questions, one of the questioners gave an indication of it gave an indication of certain type of concern about, are we suggesting that people should be mujtahid mutlaq today? And it actually it speaks to a genuine problem in the conception of scholarship. If we have this image of the mujtahid mutlaq, and I used this term last week as well, mujtahid mutlaq sort of as a type of Superman. The mujtahid mutlaq is a type of Superman. When you have the Superman idea of mujtahid mutlaq, he's basically doing everything from scratch. Imagine if someone is I don't know, like an automobile engineer or something like that, and he comes along and says, I'm going to be mujtahid mutlaq in the field of automobile engineering, And I'm going to start from the very basics. I'm going to do ijtihad and do my own ijtihad to determine, do wheels really need to be round? And, and build from there. But that's an issue that's sort of done and dusted. I don't know how, like thousands of years ago, before there was any automobiles, that yes, wheels have to be round because they have to roll. So scholarship is a cumulative process. It's a cumulative process. When you understand scholarship as a cumulative process, obviously, simply due to various factors, such as these early imams, for example, someone like Malik, someone like Abu Hanifa, they were seeing tabi'in directly. People who spent years with the companions. So obviously, they have an understanding of the Sharia. They have eyewitness knowledge of things that are beyond us. So no one can attain that. But at the same time, it needs to be understood that even with these imams, what they were doing was a process of cumulative scholarship. They're not destroying what those who came before. They're building on it. And so if we understand that as that is what ijtihad is about, the mujtahid is not someone who destroys what 1400. I mean, and now we're basically working with over 1400 years of scholarship. The mujtahid would not be someone who destroys 1400 years of scholarship. The mujtahid would be someone who builds on that 1400 years of scholarship. Someone who is able to process and synthesize, and yes, at times critique, because not everything in the 1400. Because obviously, anytime you have different opinions in that scholarly tradition, you're going to have to critique something or another. One of the opinions is going to be stronger than the other. Someone has made a mistake somewhere, so there's going to be a process of critique involved as well. But that's a critique of individual scholarly opinions. It's not a critique. It's not a critique. It's not a critique of the scholarly tradition. It's not. It's just to. The purpose is not to destroy the scholarly tradition and the tradition of ijtihad and fiqh that we have inherited from the four madhabs and from the very first imams of ijtihad from the Sahaba and the Tabi'in. So that concern that exists about ijtihad, that what are you saying? Everyone should be a mujtahid mutlaq. No, we're not. We're saying that ijtihad needs to be done. Ijtihad needs to be done. And last week we talked about some of the aspects of that show that that there is a need for ijtihad, but that ijtihad that needs to be done is going to be ijtihad building on the tradition. It's not going to be ijtihad that says just throw that scholarly tradition out the window, because that would be absurd. I don't know if there was a point you wanted to make about Mufti Taqi's paper that you didn't get to.
Yeah, sorry, I went back in time there. So basically, so Mufti Taqi has a paper that he released in 1983 at an Islamic conference in Algeria. It was called Manhajul Ijtihad fil Asr al-Hadir in July 1983. So basically, he identifies the need for ijtihad's necessity in the modern era. So I'll just read a bit in Arabic and I'll translate a bit because it goes on for 20, 30 pages. So so this is in 1983. Bear that in mind. This is the context, 1983, even before when I was born. So he says, وقد كتب الباحثون عن الاجتهاد بحوثا ربما تملأ المكتبات فمن زاعم يزعم أن باب الاجتهاد مسدود منذ قرون بجميع أنواعه وأقسامه. So he says that some people believe that the door of ijtihad has been shut for centuries in all of its types and formats. ولا يجوز لرجل اليوم في حال من الأحوال أن يطمع في دخول هذا الباب. ولكن هذا الرأي خطأ من البداهة. He says that this position that Ijtihad is closed in all of his formats is evidently an error. فإن كل يوم يأتي بمسائله الجديدة ومشاكل الحديثة. So basically he identifies that new issues come up nowadays that were never present before, which don't have a specific mention in the Quran and Sunnah, nor any precedence in the early books of the fuqaha. So to identify a ruling of the Sharia in those particular issues, you would need, he says, فلا بد من المصير لمعرفة أحكامها إلى نوع من اجتهاد. Some form of ijtihad is required in order to identify a ruling associated with those new issues. ولو فرضنا أن بابه مقفول للأبد لما عرفنا أحكام هذه المخترعات الحديثة. If the door was shut forever on these matters for ijtihad, then we would never know the rulings of newly invented matters such as the train, the plane, the microphone, because there was an issue with microphones and whether salah would be valid or not when hearing an imam via microphone. Television, he says, and other electronic devices. So that's one opinion, that ijtihad has been shut, and he says that that's an error. And he goes on to say, وَهُنَاكَ رَأْيٌ آخَرْ يقول, there's another position that states or that asserts إِنَّ بَابَ الْإِجْتِهَادِ مَفْتُوحٌ بِمِصْرَاعِهِ لِكُلِّ مَنْ هَبَّ وَدَبَّ. That the door of ijtihad is open for anybody who wants to pursue ijtihad, for any Tom, Dick, and Harry, basically. وَيَجُوزُ لِكُلِّ أَحَدٍ أَن يَقْتَحِمَهُ دُونَ أَيِّ شَرْطٍ أَوْ قَيْدٍ. Without any stipulation, anybody can engage with the process of ijtihad. And he says that وَإِنَّ هَذَا خَطَأٌ وَضَلَالٌ أَيْضًا. So that's an error as well, because obviously for ijtihad, you would need some sort of background, some sort of understanding of Sharia, some sort of understanding of how ijtihad operated in the previous eras, some sort of understanding of scholarly opinions that have gone by, and to build on that process. And then he answers three questions basically. ما هو الاجتهاد المطلوب في العصر الحاضر? What is the ijtihad that is needed for the contemporary era? Number one. And number two, من هو الذي يقوم بهذا الاجتهاد? What is the profile of the scholar who will carry out this ijtihad? And number three, ما هي منهجية تنظيم هذا الاجتهاد وتطبيقه في الحياة العملية? How would we identify the methodology of this type of ijtihad in the modern era, and how would we apply it practically in the lives of Muslims today? So this paper has been published in his Maqalat al-Uthmani. I would recommend any student of knowledge to refer to that, in addition to the many other articles that have been written on Manhajiyatul Ijtihad fil Asr al-Hadir. Basically, ijtihad is not only permissible in this era for those who are qualified to do it, but it is a necessity. And not only is it a necessity, one would be correct to identify such activities as ijtihad and nothing else. So we need to cast away with this superficial aversion to the term ijtihad that was developed in the past century or so, even beyond that, due to various factors that beset the ummah, I would say.
Okay. I want to actually move on to another point, which is, we touched on this briefly last week, but I don't think we had too much opportunity to discuss it at length. But this idea that obviously we have well-established tradition for madhabs, very rich, very long tradition with these madhabs. But if we're speaking about ijtihad in the modern era, and based on what we discussed last week, talking about there being really an extensive need for ijtihad in a lot of issues, it really does raise questions about what does that mean for the role of the madhahib in the modern world, or as you put it last week, are we basically in a post-Madhhab era? Do you want to address that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about madhabs, it's important to identify how the madhahib developed. And one would assume, though it's not a correct assumption, that the founders of the four madhahib and even the other madhahib, but in particularly the four madhahib, which because they're the one who that have survived, that the leading figures after whom the madhahib have been named, so the four imams are Abu Hanifa, but in particular Imam Malik, Imam al-Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad, that they intended to create a standalone madhab that would be named after them. Is this assumption correct? Now,
Right.
if we look at the four imams, they all have their own separate stories when it comes to the development of the madhahib. So let's work backwards now. Imam Ahmad, and you're more familiar with Imam Ahmad, but I'll just.
Yeah, I think with Imam Ahmad, it's very safe to say that he was against the codification of fiqh. He was against, irrespective of whether he was right about this or wrong, but he was against the codification of fiqh to the point that, and it's not clear to me what exactly is his later position and his earlier position, but I think this is most likely his later position, that later in his life he became increasingly concerned about this trend of people actually writing these large fiqh books, including Imam Shafi, that that because he felt that this is he referred to it as Taqlid al-Ra'i, that this is basically making what is Ijtihad and individual opinion, it's sort of it's immortalizing it, it's making it something that is permanent and fixed. And so he was concerned that this will then disconnect people from the inherited fiqh of obviously the Quran and the Sunnah, and the inherited fiqh of the Sahaba and the and the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. So clearly he did not intend to create a madhab. That goes without saying. Now that doesn't mean that it's a problem that a madhab is then created out of his fiqh. I'm not suggesting that, but and this is not unlike the discussion that happened some generations earlier, where you had a group of ulama who actually were against the writing down of hadith. They said that you should memorize like we memorized, starting with some of the Sahaba and then some of the Tabi'een. So we had this concern from Imam Ahmad that basically he was concerned that it would turn into something like what it turned into, ironically, the writing down of fiqh. And I'm not saying that is actually a problem, but clearly this was not his intent. I mean, I think that is very safe to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So the point being emphasized here is the human endeavor associated with the preservations of opinions of a particular scholar. So I'm presuming that is Abu Bakr al-Khalal, a couple of generations down from Imam Ahmad, who gathered the opinions of Imam Ahmad, and it is from there on that his opinions took the shape of a madhab akin to the madhab of Shafi and Imam Malik.
Right. If it's not for the compilation of al-Khalal, I mean, Allah alam, somebody else might have done it, but basically, barring the work that al-Khalal did or someone else picking up that mantle and doing it, the Hanbali madhab would not have been the fourth madhab. There would not have been a fourth madhab. Imam Ahmad would have ended up like many of the other famous early Mujtahid Imams, who we have some of their fiqh, we have some of their opinions, they're reported to us, but they didn't succeed or scholars who followed those opinions didn't succeed in turning them into a lasting madhab. Basically a lasting institution.
Particularly Ahlul Hadith scholars of the orientation of Imam Ahmad. I mean, there's quite a few Mujtahids within the Ahlul Hadith movement, within the classical period. It just turns out that Imam Ahmad, from that body of scholars, is identified with the madhab.
I think it's I think it's also safe to say that Imam Ahmad was definitely the most prominent of them as well, which is probably both in terms of his knowledge of his fiqh. In his knowledge of fiqh, he was the most prominent of them. Speaking about his generation, he was the most prominent of them for fiqh, as well as the status and acclaim that he attained because of his position in the mihna, and the sort of the symbolic value that this had for Ahl al-Hadith, and how this he was an imam already before the mihna. He was an imam already before the mihna, but certainly that was instrumental in raising his status. But yes, there are some others. You have Abu Thawr, who like Imam Ahmad is a student of Shafi'i. You have later on, you have basically a generation later, you have Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. So you have a number of them, but certainly Imam Ahmad is the most prominent of them. So it's not I think it's not surprising, given his the importance of his personality to the Ahl al-Hadith, both theologically as well as his being a proficient faqih, as well as being an imam in hadith. All of these sort of factors came together in him. I think that's probably why his ends up having such a following.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to Imam al-Shafi'i. Now, Imam al-Shafi'i was born in Gaza, I believe, and moved to Makkah at a very young age.
There's difference of opinion. There's difference of opinion as to whether or not he was born in Gaza, as in Gaza in Palestine, or Gaza as in the area known as Gaza in Makkah itself. But Allah alam, whichever one it is, he's in Makkah from a very young age.
But the story later on in life, I think he is identified as Gaza as well. I'm not sure where he stayed up all night, and he was warned by his host, I believe it was some family member of his own cousin, that if you keep on writing stuff that goes against Malik, people are going to forget about you. He had relatives in Gaza. So is that Palestine, or is that
from Allah alam, but from what I recall, there's not anything conclusive as to which Gaza is intended.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So he grew up in Makkah basically and studied under Muslim Khalid al-Zanji before going to Medina. So Imam al-Shafi'i is the first real scholar who's not associated heavily with a particular region, because he took in equal measure from the major centers of fiqh scholarship, the Amsar. So basically, he was in Makkah, started out there. Then he went to Medina and studied under Malik. Yeah. Then he went to Iraq. Obviously, he had various travels across the Muslim state at the time. And then he ended up in Egypt. So the question here is, before we talk about his madhab, when exactly did he become a Mujtahid Mutlaq, if we're going to go by that taxonomy? Because he studied under Imam Malik, and it is clearly identified in the Tabaqat of the Malikiyya that for a very long period of time, al-Shafi'i was identified as from the Ashab of Imam Malik.
Basically until he came to Egypt, he was still seen as an associate of Malik. And this is interesting because that actually encompasses the entirety of the period of what is known as al-Madhhab al-Qadim.
Yeah.
So al-Madhhab al-Qadim, and it's a bit like what sometimes you'll find some Shafi'is say about the Hanbali Madhhab, that the Hanbali Madhhab is basically wajh min al-wujuh fi al-Madhhab al-Qadim, which might sound disrespectful, but there's actually some truth to it. It's not altogether without truth. The same way that Shah Waliullah could say that that Abu Hanifa was doing takhrij on Ibrahim's madhab. So there is a relationship there. For Shafi'i with Malik, there is a relationship there, and it's a significant relationship. He was identified as a follower of Malik, and I think he could have very well have continued to be identified as a follower of Malik had it not been for the fact that in Egypt, he basically had sort of a tussle with some of the Malikis there who were very strongly opposed to him. Had it not been for that, he might very well have been continued to be identified in that fashion, in spite of him being as independent as he was, and having written his own fiqh. Because obviously, al-Madhhab al-Qadim, including al-Risala al-Qadima, he wrote before he came to Egypt, which is where he, where the tension between him and some of the Maliki scholars really started, and so he basically becomes, somewhat of a separate camp from them. And even with him becoming somewhat of a separate camp from them, you have Abdullah ibn Abdul Hakam. Abdul Hakam or Abdul Hakam?
Ibn Abdul Hakam.
Ibn Abdul Hakam. Yes, Ibn Abdul Hakam. He sends his son Muhammad to study with him. Muhammad studies with him, and he's with him all the way until he dies. And then after his death, he carries on being an imam of the Maliki school. So it's interesting that relationship. It's important for us to, when trying to understand these relationships, to not back project our notions of madhabs as a sort of a fixed institution to which you have a sort of allegiance to or an affiliation with, to the time of these imams, because this notion didn't exist in that fashion. Yes, schools existed, but the regional schools are not madhabs in the form that we come to know madhabs in a later period. So there wasn't necessarily a contradiction between Shafi'i being Sahibu Malik, or min ashabi Malik, and also being what we would now call a Mujtahid Mutlaq. I mean, obviously he wasn't calling himself Mujtahid Mutlaq because, again, this is another one of those terms that they didn't have in their time. They didn't have, Fulan is Mujtahid Mutlaq and Fulan does, he does Ijtihad fil Madhab, and Fulan is min ashab al-wujuh, which is funny because you get some of these discussions sometimes about, well, what exactly is the relationship of Muhammad and Abu Yusuf to Abu Hanifa? You have these different opinions. And I think Muhammad and Abu Yusuf, if they were actually to read some of the discussions about this, what are you guys talking about? What does any of this even mean? Because they're not necessarily that, doesn't necessarily mean that therefore that these categorizations are necessarily wrong, but you have to be careful not to back project them onto people who didn't have a concept of them, because these are taqsimat that developed later. So the relationship of Shafi'i to Malik is interesting, but even Ahmed's relationship to a Shafi'i is like that. I mean, Ahmed explicitly says that he makes taqlid of a Shafi'i when he doesn't know what position to take. I mean, to what extent does he do that? Allah A'lam. That again, it's difficult to say, but we know that we have statements from him that he did that. Even it's also interesting to note that you'll find that there's a host of issues on which Ahmed's opinion actually agrees with al-Madhhab al-Qadim. And some of the issues on which you'll find that, for example, that Ahmed and Shafi'i are differing, and Ahmed is agreeing with Malik. Well, Malik's opinion is oftentimes al-Madhhab al-Qadim. So these relationships, they exist, and there's not any and the influence, it exists, and there's not really any getting around that. So it's interesting in terms of of understanding what was actually going on. A Shafi'i, I think very clearly, if you read his writing, with al-Risala and then with al-Umm, he probably is the one who in which sort of the stereotypical idea of what it means to be a Mujtahid Mutlaq in the minds of later generations, he's probably the one who most closely sort of fits that model. Because he wrote his own usul, which, one of the important things that they mention about Mujtahid Mutlaq, and particularly one who's mustaqil, is that he needs to have his own usul. Well, he wrote his usul. Of the four, he's the only one who wrote his usul. So he's the only one that, basically, if that's the standard of being a Mujtahid Mutlaq, then he's the only one that we know actually had his own usul. Because, what exactly are the usuli differences between Abu Hanifa and Ibrahim, Allah Adam? What exactly are the usuli differences between, let's say, Malik and his fiqh teachers, Allah alam. What exactly are the usuli differences between Ahmed and a Shafi'i? Again, Allahu alam. But with a Shafi'i, he's written his own usul. So based on this notion that we have now, I'm not saying that this is an accurate way to judge or to measure, but based on that, the one who sort of seems to fit that model is a Shafi'i. But then you have the ideas about sort of the authority of the Mujtahid and the lesser levels of Ijtihad and Madhab affiliation that are built on the authority of the Mujtahid Mutlaq. I'm not sure, I think I can say with some degree of confidence that a Shafi'i would probably have looked at some of those things and said, I'm not sure about that.
And also,
at least in his time, because obviously these are later developments. I mean, he didn't live in those times when those developments happened.
Yeah, if you were to ask a person when exactly, so in the case of Imam Ahmad, we know when Abu Bakr al-Khalal came along, that's when his opinions took the shape of a madhab. In the case of Imam al-Shafi'i, when exactly did he have a madhab per se? We know he was a mujtahid before, but when exactly did he develop a madhab of his own? Is there any point in his life where you can pinpoint, oh, now you have a madhab, before that you didn't have a madhab? It's not.
No, I mean, obviously not. Even with Imam Ahmad, I mean, you're talking about with al-Khalal, you're really talking about when does it become a madhab that has a foundation on which the madhab, in the sense of a madhab as an institution, as a scholarly guild as we've come to know it, when is it sort of born? Yeah, maybe that birth moment is al-Khalal, the Jami' of al-Khalal for the Hanbali madhab. For a Shafi'i, maybe it's when he writes down his own fiqh, which goes back to his al-Madhhab al-Qadim. That maybe that is the moment. But obviously, his works of al-Madhhab al-Qadim are then sort of drowned out by him rewriting them, and what becomes the works of al-Madhhab al-Jadid, which is basically what has reached us of his writings, al-Umm and al-Risala, basically. Yeah. So, it's more a question of, I think, with these four madhabs, what are the factors that were present in the scholarship of these imams, or in some cases their students, and that allowed them to actually become madhabs in the sense that we know them, and to endure in the fashion that they did. I mean, I think obviously with each one it's a little bit different. In a Shafi'i's case, it's very clear. Shafi'i wrote his own fiqh and his own usul, and people took that from him. And I think one of the reasons that you don't have any important figures from Ahlul Hadith sort of having a surviving madhab other than Ahmed, aside from the fact that perhaps they were drowned out by others, is the fact that a Shafi'i for the Muhaddithin then became a very central figure. And so Shafi'i for the Ahlul Hadith is then no less important a figure as a faqih than Ahmed. I mean, if anything, Shafi'i is more important because Shafi'i wrote his fiqh. So you have, if you go through the biographies of famous Muhaddithin, including Muhaddithin who are Huffaz, Nuqad of Hadith, Muhaddithin who became Qudat, such as Imam al-Nasa'i. Imam al-Nasa'i was a Qadi. As well as being one of the Imams of Ilal. And it's mentioned in the biographical sources that he actually wrote a book on manasik on the madhab of Shafi'i. But obviously, this is the characterization of whoever has reported this information to us. What exactly did that mean to them? I mean, may not be entirely clear. But An-Nasa'i and many of the others of the Muhaddithin, it's not incorrect to identify them as Shafi'i. Maybe not Shafi'i in the sense that we come to know that what these affiliations come to mean in a later generation. But yes, the affiliation was there. And the affiliation was a very important one. A Shafi'i really represented, for many of the Ahlul Hadith, he represented their fiqh. or put another way, he was the most important expression and the most important representation of their fiqh, because obviously he wrote all of his fiqh down. So you find, for example, Imam Muslim, he has a juz, which is lost to us now, but he has a juz he wrote about the hadith of ad-dibagh, about tanning, meta to turn it into leather, and is this process of tanning, does it make it permissible and what have you. So he has a juz that he wrote about these hadiths, and there's a passage from it that Imam al-Bayhaqi quotes in one of his books, where he quotes Imam Muslim basically saying that that Imam Shafi'i did not build any of the masail of his madhab on weak hadiths. So again, maybe we don't know the full context in which he was speaking, but clearly, there's a certain sense of intisar to Imam Shafi'i and the madhab of Imam Shafi'i, that look, his madhab is built on authentic hadiths. And obviously, some of these hadiths have been authenticated. The hadiths about dibagh have been authenticated by Imam Muslim. Some of them are in his Sahih. Bukhari, incidentally, doesn't have any of the hadiths of dibagh in his Sahih. And Imam Ahmad, basically, at least in many of his riwayat, he makes it alal. He considers all of them to be weak. So the famous view in his madhab is actually against the Shafi'i. But it seems from the context, it seems that that Muslim is basically here. He's setting out to defend Imam Shafi'i. So Imam Shafi'i, his act, the creative act of writing these works, laying out that fiqh, it had a major impact. It had a major impact on the fiqh of the Ahl al-Hadith. And so I don't think there was really any scope for anyone, aside from Ahmed, because of the factors that we mentioned. There wasn't any scope for anyone else to reach that same level of fame and acceptance, and then for his madhab to endure in Ahl al-Hadith circles the way that Shafi'is did. Obviously, you have the Maliki madhab, and so you do have some people who are very important muhaddithin post the Shafi'i, who are Malikis, and one of them being al-Qadi Ismail ibn Ishaq, one of al-Maliki, one of the very important Maliki scholars of Basra, descended from Hamad ibn Zayd, the Imam of Ahl al-Basra, and basically part of a very important Maliki scholarly family. But he's also a student of a number of the important Imams in Hadith, and is in his own right an Imam in Hadith. So, but again, that is, you have to consider the sort of the authority and personal presence and importance that Imam Malik has, and that's from even before a Shafi'i. So post the Shafi'i, I don't think it's surprising that no one other than Ahmed, that his madhab survives, and Ahmed's madhab only survives because of the Jabr.
It is also interesting to know at this time the process of divorce between the Shafi'i school of the Shafi'i school from the Imam Malik school. So there was a clear trajectory. We see that in the beginning, he was warned not to go against Malik, otherwise he as a scholar, his legacy would die, because Imam Malik's legacy would overpower everyone. He was warned by, as I mentioned earlier on, at a house of one of his family members in Gaza. And then when he went to Egypt, there was some hostility between himself and Ashhab, the student of Malik. And then towards the end, it's progressing. So towards the end, just before Imam al-Shafi'i died, he appointed Imam al-Buwaiti in his kursi to teach after him. So Ibn Abd al-Hakam, whom we just mentioned, he was upset at that fact. He wanted the kursi. So as a result, he left the Shafi'i circle of Egypt and became a Maliki again, which is, again, painting a human face to the issue of madhahib. which is necessary, I
Yes,
think.
it does. I mean, very, very much so. I mean, there's even reports that Ashhab would make dua against Shafi'i in his sujood. You know, Allahumma amit Shafi'i la yadhhab ilmu Malik. Allahu alam how authentic some of these reports are. And again, you also have to keep in mind that we're now so many centuries removed, and there's an element of qila wa qal, that this person is saying that, oh, look, these guys were doing this, and then the other side has their story. So I don't want to impugn the intentions of any of these people,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
it's a very human thing. It's a very human thing, and these all of these things, they're very human sort of so human beings are human beings at the end of the day. Yahya ibn Ma'in was not a fan of a Shafi at all, and a couple of times he exchanged words with Imam Ahmed about that. And there's so many of these that these things that can be mentioned. تلك أمة قد خلت لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت. And we can only make dua for them. Obviously, all of these, they're great ulama and have made their important contributions, and along the ways they've made mistakes. And it's not just, you see this with some of these fiqhi rivalries. It happened with the Dhuhli and al-Bukhari. This is what the ulama say, kalam al-Aqran yutwa wala yurwa. Although it's sometimes it's important to be aware of these things, to humanize. That at the end of the day, these scholars were human beings. They weren't malaika. They weren't ma'sumin. We don't have 4 ma'sum imams or 12 ma'sum imams, more or less, or we don't believe that the Khulafa al-Rashidin are ma'sum, much less much less the 4 imams, much less their students and their students, much less someone who's a muqallid of one of these madhabs centuries later. So in that sense, yes, these people sometimes made mistakes. Sometimes they did things that are, there's a human element that is understandable. Maybe someone like Ibn Abdul Hakam genuinely thought that this al-Buwaiti is maybe he has these positive qualities, but he has other negative qualities, and I'm more qualified. Sometimes not every teacher is right in his assessment about all this. I'm not saying that Shafi was wrong about his assessment. Again, please, no one misconstrue any of the things I'm saying here. But it's
go on.
Yeah. But it's a very human sort of reaction.
In an era where madhahib have been raised to a level which they were never intended to be, I think these humanizing events and stories are a necessary read. And Suyuti's Jazilul Mawahib fi Ikhtilaf al-Madhahib, where he mentions where he numbers dozens of scholars who switched madhahib, not because of the dalil or ijtihad, but because of other factors like financial considerations or these petty disputes. It's an interesting read, and it's a necessary read to ensure that we understand that the affiliation to any one madhab or another, it wasn't, let's say, 100% pure or ideal in every single instance for the past 1200 years that have gone by. I mean, there's been events right from the beginning for centuries onwards after that, which are an interesting read nonetheless. Let's leave it at that.
Let me just say, for those who are following live, if you have any questions, please write your questions in the chat, and we will take your questions in a little bit.
Sometimes scholars switch madhab due to theological considerations, some for financial considerations, some for switching city altogether, some for trying to get a job in a particular madhab-based waqf. I mean, there were dozens of considerations, and there's an interesting article on the Arabic Al Jazeera website which lists out scholars switching madhab due to non-religious purposes. Okay, so let's move on to Imam Malik when we talk about when his mother became a mother. So Imam Malik taught the Muwatta for decades, and he had students flocking to him for decades, and he was the epitome of the Ahlul Hadith movement in the time. But in his time, still, regional fiqh was in the vogue. So he was the Madhab of Ahlul Medina at that time. He wasn't the Madhab of Imam Malik then. And alongside him was Ibn Abi Dhib, which some scholars consider to be an even greater knowledgeable scholar than Imam Malik. And he was known to give the rulers, the Abbasid rulers, a telling off in a manner which Imam Malik never did. I mean, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur came from Iraq once to, he was going for Hajj, and they were passed in Medina, and Ibn Abi Dhib was teaching in one corner of the masjid, and Malik was teaching in the other corner of the masjid. So they all stood up, including Imam Malik, except Ibn Abi Dhib. So Ibn Abi Dhib said, I'll only stand for Allah. I don't need to stand for Mansur. Anyway. Whereas Imam Malik was more diplomatic than Ibn Abi Dhib. But obviously, Ibn Abi Dhib, due to a lack of students or other considerations, his legacy didn't survive in a manner that obviously Imam Malik's did. And pretty much he developed a cohort of students, Imam Malik did, who would carry on his Muwatta, and by way of his Muwatta, his Fiqhi Madhab. So it's his Muwatta that was influential in him having a Madhab and his Madhab spreading.
You know, that's it's interesting you mentioned. There's two with Malik. There's two things. One is how many students he had. Literally, you know, the hadith that is reported from the Prophet ﷺ, I know there's differing opinions about its authenticity, but you know, the hadith that is reported that soon people will set out and they will not find anyone more knowledgeable to take from than the alim of Medina. And obviously, the more popular view is that this refers to Imam Malik. Others have suggested other names, but I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's Imam Malik, considering the you know, no one was being made rihla to in his time like Imam Malik, and so had so many students, so many people who took the Muwatta from him, so many people who took fiqh along with the Muwatta from him and then spread that. I think, you know, that was instrumental. And then a number of his students in one form or another documenting his fiqh. And then obviously one of the most important documentations of that fiqh is the Asadiyya, which then evolves into the Mudawwana, which has the input of Asad ibn Furat and Muhammad ibn al-Qasim and Sahnun. You know, obviously this story will be well known to anyone who is familiar with the historical development of these Madhab. But but in addition to the Mudawwana, you have other works as well that document the fiqh of Malik. So you know, this corpus develops where you have the core is sort of Imam Malik's Muwatta, because that is what he wrote himself, and that is how, you know, he sort of propagated his fiqh himself. And you also get a considerable glimpse of his methodology in Ijtihad, his methodology in fiqh. And then, you know, these other works come to sort of fill a lot of the gaps that are necessary to have a full, well-developed, mature madhab. Because at the end of the day, the amount of fiqh that is in Malik's Muwatta, no doubt it might be excellent as a foundation, but that certainly doesn't mean that it covers everything. So, you know, so again, you have the students, the writings of the students, together with this very important, very pivotal, very influential work of the Imam. I think these two factors allowed for his madhab to survive. And it's also important that his Muwatta does have a very unique sort of style in terms of the way that it blends fiqh with hadith in a fashion that is, you know, you certainly don't find it from anyone before him. So it's relatively unprecedented. Obviously, we don't have a lot of books of his contemporaries, but even then, I don't think that, you know, that if we had the books of his contemporaries, that any of them would be as important as his is. Because most likely, if it was, it probably would have reached us.
With regards to his relationship with the Abbasid Khulafa, Imam Malik's relationship with the Abbasid Khulafa, obviously in the beginning you had Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who it's funny when we discuss these things, because Abu Ja'far al-Mansur had Imam Abu Hanifa lashed in prison and he died in prison, but with Imam Malik he had a more convivial, cordial relationship. So Abu Ja'far al-Mansur was the first Khalifa out of 3 to suggest to Imam Malik to not only write the Muwatta, but I assume he was already in the beginnings of writing the Muwatta by the time Abu Ja'far al-Mansur came to Medina, but have it imposed across the Muslim Ummah, which Imam Malik refused. Then that same proposal was suggested to him by not the Khalifa after him, Mahdi, but Hadi, the one after him. He said the same. This is in the Tabaqat of Ibn Farqun. Then after that, Harun al-Rashid made the same proposal again to him. Now imagine Harun al-Rashid, with the Chief Justice of Abu Yusuf at the time, asking Imam Malik to have the Muwatta imposed across the Muslim state. And on all 3 occasions, Imam Malik said no. Now, given that we've identified the very human association of madhahib, Imam Malik could have easily said yes on any one of these 3 occasions, especially in the time of Harun al-Rashid, when his scholarship was more mature and his Muwatta was far more edited, and all the riwayat which he didn't want in there sieved out. He could have said at that time, okay, now is the time where I would like my work to be imposed across a Muslim state. Even then he said no, because he said obviously famously that the scholars have spread across the Muslim lands and views have become entrenched, and I don't want people to leave what they're used to. But he could have done so in a manner which Uthman radiallahu anh did with the Quran, disposing of the other dialects and keeping with the Qurashi dialect. So I quip that if Imam Malik said yes on any one of these occasions, the Hanafi mother would have died a slow death, even with Imam Abu Yusuf at the helm of the Chief Justice in Iraq. But such was the status of Malik even in Iraq with the Khulafa, whom they would only meet occasionally when they come down to Hajj, etc., etc.
This brings up an interesting point. By the way, I personally, I'm skeptical that this actually happened 3 times. It may very well be only once, and
the Hadi narration I'm not sure. Dubious, but the Abu Ja'far Mansur and Harun al-Rashid, I think, are slightly more stronger.
It's possible. It's possible. But the thing is, I actually wonder. It's been a long time since I've visited any of these reports. But I actually wonder at the moment. It's coming to my mind is maybe it actually could actually be al-Hadi, because al-Hadi is someone that nobody would think to mention unless that's what actually happened. Al-Mansur is the name that sort of pops to mind as a famous Abbasid Khalifa, and Harun al-Rashid is also one who pops to mind. Al-Hadi is much less important. At least this is what's sort of popping to my mind right now. Although in any case, I'm not sure how many times it happened and who exactly asked, but definitely he could have agreed to that request, and it could significantly have changed the face of fiqh as we come to know it. Maybe the considerable influence that the writings of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan come to have in the way that fiqh is shaped, because he writes his Kitab al-Asl, it then becomes important not just for the Hanafi madhab, but also for other madhab, because Asad ibn al-Furat, as you're probably well aware, wrote the books of Ra'i, meaning the books of Muhammad ibn Hasan, probably Abu Yusuf as well. And then he went and he started asking these questions to Ibn al-Qasim that, let's develop, this sort of this body of fiqh. And so, then on top of that, we know that Shafi'i read these works. Shafi'i read these works as well. Maybe, I mean, depending on the timeline, maybe, Muhammad ibn Hasan, his trajectory of his activity changes. Maybe the reception of his works change. Maybe a Shafi doesn't write the works that he goes on to write. Maybe he ends up writing a Sharh of Muwatta or something. I don't know. You could, although in some sense you could see his is heavily draws on the Muwatta anyways, but obviously he uses it. He uses all those hadiths very much for his own purposes, not how Malik was using them. So it could radically have changed the face of fiqh as we've come to know it. At least created a very different trajectory from what we came to know, and he didn't do that. And it's something to his credit, because when you're in that situation, it can always be very tempting. So I've put all this work into it. The Muwatta is certainly deserving.
He was following the Dalil. He had the Muwatta with him.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, how dare he not impose a Muwatta?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So do you want to basically talk about the Hanafi?
Yeah, I'm going to press on to the Hanafi Madhab, then I'm going to go fast forward in the future, about 1200 years.
Okay, so let's talk about the Hanafi Madhab.
Yeah, so Imam Abu Hanifa, okay. So did Imam Abu Hanifa intend to create a madhab of his own?
I mean, I don't know if he could have foreseen the madhahib in the sense that we have come to know them. I don't think he would necessarily have foreseen a development like that. And as far as we know, there's not anything that clearly establishes. You can correct me on this. I might be wrong about this, but did Abu Hanifa write any books?
Not in fiqh, at least.
And yeah, in fiqh, it seems, wallahu alam, that he didn't write any books, whether small or large. And so his fiqh is largely written by Muhammad ibn Hasan. So, in a sense, someone might ask the question, well, Muhammad ibn Hasan is a mujtahid in his own right. Why doesn't he have his own madhab? But ironically, the reason he doesn't have his own madhab is because he was too busy creating Abu Hanifa. Because that act of writing those books, the books that come to be known as books of Zahir Riwayah, that really is sort of the foundation on which the madhab then develops. I suppose if he really wanted to, he could have said, you know what, I'm a mujtahid. I'm going to write a book about my fiqh, or a series of books about my fiqh.
You had the Abu Hanifa's tutelage and also Imam Malik's. Even only for 2 or 3 years, but still he studied with Abu Yusuf after that. So he could have had a both worlds madhab, but he didn't decide to do that.
He could have, but instead he more or less. And again, I think a question that people oftentimes ask is, why does this? Although not that the other Imams' students don't have their own opinions, but it's something that's very clear that you see in the Hanafi madhab when you read so many of the Hanafi fiqh books, that you get in every issue Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad, and occasionally Zufar maybe as well. But these three are so ever present in so many of the texts. Obviously, you have some mukhtasarat that maybe that drop the names and different opinions, but so many of the central texts of the madhab, you get Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad ibn Hasan again and again. And so people might wonder, well, why is that? Why did the Hanafi madhab develop in this way? And then you even have some people who are saying that no, the Hanafi madhab should be the fiqh of Abu Hanifa, and Abu Yusuf's ijtihad represents himself, and Muhammad's ijtihad represents himself. And the funny thing is that the reason it is this way is because Muhammad ibn Hassan made it this way. And so it shows the importance of the influence of these sorts of projects that scholars engaged in, that sort of then become the founding stone, the building block on which the madhab is built. Because Muhammad ibn Hassan wrote his works in this way, which is consistently documenting the opinions of these three personalities, including himself, the Hanafi, this then has very important influence on the way that the Hanafi madhab develops, because then that is what scholars for generations are studying. So so this is an important point about madhabs and the way that madhabs develop. And also it relates somewhat to what we mentioned about Imam Ahmed and why he was so much against Taqlid al-Ra'i, as he called it. If you spend generations reading a certain book, and you have an entire scholarly community that revolves around the study of a particular book or a particular set of books, it's not surprising then that so much of the discussion then revolves around what is in those books. So in a sense, you have the sort of Taqlid al-Ra'i that Imam Ahmed was concerned about. That's a natural outcome. And so with the Hanafi madhab becomes basically this amalgamation of these opinions of these three authorities, with Abu Hanifa being sort of the highest in the hierarchy, of course, because he's their teacher. It's natural then that the madhab develops in this fashion, because this is how Muhammad ibn Hassan, and in the sense that Al-Khalal is the founder of the Hanbali madhab, or at least his project is the foundation act or the cornerstone of the Hanbali madhab, then Muhammad ibn Hassan is sort of the founder of the Hanafi madhab in the sense of sort of institutionalizing it, codifying it. And so naturally it takes the trajectory that he sets for it originally. And so, it's again, we see the human element. Why does a Shafi'i not do that with Malik? Why does Ahmed not do that with a Shafi'i? Well, it very well. So sometimes in jest, sometimes you'll find Shafi'i students will say to Hanbali students that, aslan your madhab is just it's wajh min al-wujuh fil madhab al-qadim. But the thing is that if Ahmed had undertaken a project something like what Muhammad ibn Hassan did, it could have ended up being something like that. It could have ended up, وقال الشافعي وبه أقول وقال الشافعي وأذهب إلى كذا. Had he done something like that, we would have had something else. So why did it end up this way? Because Al-Khalal made it this way.
It's a pedagogical issue, and also Abu Yusuf had a role on a judicial level in the spread of the madhab. Right. And I would assume, coming back to the human element, a lot of scholars would have wanted to adopt the Hanafi madhab just to get a position in the judiciary. I mean, we don't see cases of that documented per se within his time, and also given the fact that it was in Iraq and people would have naturally been mostly Hanafi or Iraqi anyway at the time on the Iraqi madhab. But it did play in no small part in the spread of the Hanafi stroke Iraqi school. But with that said, it is interesting to note that there was another major madhab in Kufa at the time, alongside Abu Hanifa, and that's Sufyan al-Thawri, which survived for a number of centuries. Unfortunately, his works haven't survived, or his students or the people associated with him.
Interestingly, I believe if I recall correctly, I think Ibn Rajab in Fath al-Bari, in one or two places, he quotes something as the opinion of Sufyan, saying that he found this in the works of some of his ashab who've written according to his madhab. So it seems he actually had some work or another that someone had actually written based on the fiqh of Sufyan. But again, if we look at what are the factors, well, number one, Sufyan never wrote his fiqh, not in the fashion that you see with Muhammad ibn Hassan or others. Then Sufyan also spent much of his adult life basically in hiding from one Khalifa or another, and he was basically wanted. The Khalifa intended to execute him. So it's kind of hard to have a fiqh class when you're also on the run from the state, and so we have this. He didn't develop. The fiqh that he left behind didn't develop into a madhab. Possibly, it could have, had the right factors been present. So we see, that again, this is not to take anything away from the scholarship before Imams. Obviously, their scholarship was such that it merited the preservation of their fiqh. But there's a host of factors that came into play, and some of those factors are function of the high level of scholarship of those imams. But there's a number of factors that can come into play that determine that that these madhabs would then be codified and developed and survive. And even some madhabs that initially in early stages some form of that happened, but then they didn't survive. Again, it's an interesting discussion to look at. Well, what are the factors that were at play? Why does Abu Thawr's madhab not survive? Maybe it's simply just because Abu Thawr was a lesser student of. He was a student of a Shafi'i, and perhaps just not as great a faqih as a Shafi'i. And so, while he has some followers for a time, it doesn't last. So there's a number of factors at play, but there is very much a human there are all these human elements that are at play here.
So let's move on in future from the four imams. So the importance or significance that is attached to these madhahib later on, especially in the context of you have madhab specific qada or madhab specific awqaf, or madhab-specific seminaries and colleges, or even later on madhab-specific maharib. Again, these are human actors that are adding to the madhab experience.
And it's an interesting point, because fiqh didn't necessarily have to develop when it became codified and institutionalized necessarily in this fashion. It did. Ultimately, that's what happened. I'm not saying that that's wrong. What are the historical factors that influenced it to happen in this way is certainly an interesting question to explore. But it didn't necessarily have to be done in this way. I mean, certainly there's not anything in the Quran and Sunnah that says that you need to have by 300 years develop madhabs based after the imams, based after the personal fiqh of the imams that they're named after. It didn't necessarily have to develop in that particular fashion, but it did. And again, obviously, there would be historical factors as a result of which that might very well have been a natural progression. But again, there's a very human element in there. That's not a product of the revelation coming down and telling us that this is the way that it needs to be done, which is sort of an interesting segue to, well, where are we now? Because you have all of these institutions that you mentioned. Historically, for whatever reasons, they developed in that fashion. That largely doesn't exist now. You don't have madhab-based judiciaries. Someone might point to Saudi Arabia, but you could say that there's a madhab-based judiciary, but it's sort of a big asterisk for reasons.
Every nation, Muslim nation state, has developed its own body of laws that are not only separate to the madhahib they were traditionally associated with, but they are in fact a departure from the Sharia in its entirety. And we've seen a number of scholars, when these nation states gained independence from the British or the other colonial powers, or after the fall of the Ottoman Khilafah, where, for example, a nation state wanted to reform inheritance laws, and you'd have a huge raft of criticisms from the scholars as to why they are departing from ilm al-fara'id, for example. But
yes.
So it's not only about madhahib when we talk about nation states anymore. It's a number of factors, including where the laws are imported from. So it's not only the madhahib. It's not only the classical text anymore. It's it's the traditional colonial powers, typically Britain or France. A lot of because if you want a functioning nation state, you need a body of law ready to be implemented and developed and implemented in those new countries, in those fledgling embryonic countries. The Muslim nations simply don't have the expertise of developing the type of laws that have been invoked for centuries in nations like France and Britain. For example, even nowadays, when there's some new technology and legislation needs to be developed in the Gulf, for example, in Kuwait or Qatar, legal experts are brought over from Britain or America, and it's developed that way. It's not as if scholars are, the politicians are consulting scholars to develop laws from the ancient fiqh texts. So this, again, is this interestingly segues us into the issue of siyasah, which you were mentioning to me earlier on. How siyasah is conducted within amongst the Muslims, because obviously there is a connection between fiqh and siyasah in Islam, Islamic law and Islamic politics. There is a connection. There's no doubt about it. And you have jurists traditionally writing on siyasah like al-Mawardi, is like Ahkam al-Sultaniya, and also Qadi Abu Ya'la, Ahkam al-Sultaniya,
al-Juwayni, and some others. And sometimes you get some of these ahkam actually in books of fiqh or in books dedicated to qada and things like that as well.
Interestingly, all these books were developed during the Abbasid Khilafah period, or most of them are. Yes. Or in the Mamluk period, but mostly in the first ones were in the Abbasid Khilafah period, which did have an influence in what they wrote. One Muslim Orientalist, a French one, I forgot his name, Roger Garaudy or someone, he said that it's a controversial statement. You can disagree with it if you want to, but he said that al-Mawardi was simply rubber stamping the policies of the Abbasids, which says a lot, because we tend to read these books, not only the fiqh books, not only the siyasah books, but the fiqh books as well. We tend to read them in a vacuum. It is really important to understand history and the historical development of these books and the background behind the authors and their status in relation to how close or how removed they were from the Khilafah, from the leaders, political leaders at the time, and how influenced they were by their respective societies. What part of the Muslim world were they living in?
Yep.
Yeah.
And Abu Ya'la and al-Mawardi, if I remember correctly, both of them did actually write their books at the request of the Khalifa. At the request of the Khalifa. So you know, with siyasah is interesting, or politics. But you know, if we look at classical discussions about certain political issues, like for example, you have the idea of the Khalifa is chosen based on bay'ah by the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. which, you know, if we look at that and say, okay, well, what exactly are the ramifications of this now? And then we look at some of the some of the narratives that exist in modern Muslim circles about Khilafah, that, you know, we need to establish Khilafah. Again, and please, nobody misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm not saying that don't establish Khilafah. I'm not saying that Khilafah is bad. But you have, you know, these narratives about, okay, we need to establish Khilafah, and the Khalifa is chosen by Bay'ah of Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. Okay, now if we speak about the idea of Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, or people who are people who are in positions of influence, they're basically the political power brokers, the influential decision makers. If we look at, for example, in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or actually I should say in the time of the Sahaba after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how does that work? It's sort of fairly clear that you had basically a sort of a natural sort of system that existed, a natural sort of structure that existed. Arabia was basically a tribal society, and the people were sort of organized according to their tribes, and tribes had chieftains. And, you know, even being the chief of a tribe, or being one of its chiefs, wasn't necessarily, it wasn't like some, you know, sort of hereditary monarchy. Oftentimes it might pass within a family, but it was a position that came more by acclaim. It came more by you know, how active a person was in his tribe, you know, spending. So, for example, with Quraysh, we find that, you know, even in Jahiliyyah, that, you know, that the person who was the sort of became recognized as a chieftain was the one who did the most in terms of spending on the Hujjaj, spending on the Hajj, taking care of the Siqaya, doing these various activities, also doing certain things that were for the benefit of the whole tribe. And so, you know, we have someone like Abu Talib, who was basically a very senior person in the tribe of Quraysh, was in debt. Why was he in debt? Because maintaining all these activities was very difficult. So, you know, you had sort of a natural system that sort of created tribal leaders. And so those leaders, they represented their tribe. And so that was maybe different factors that were at play there, and maybe that even varied from tribe to tribe. And so if the leaders of these tribes, they agreed on something, then they spoke for their people, because the people were going to follow them. We've seen interesting sort of a reflection of this in an incident that happened, very sad incident that happens a little bit after the period of Al-Khilafah al-Rashida, in the time of Yazid. In the time of Yazid, when his armies, under the command of Muslim ibn Uqba, or Musrif ibn Uqba as he's called, when they slaughtered the people of Medina at the Battle of Al-Harra, and so the people who survived were basically being forced to give bay'at to Yazid, whether they like it or not. Banu Salima, one of the tribes of the Ansar, their people were going, because they're basically being made to go, and they're giving bay'at to Yazid. And so Muslim ibn Uqba, the commander, said, no, we will not accept the bay'ah of Banu Salima until Jabir comes, Jabir Abdullah, because basically at this point he's the most senior and most respected in the tribe, and he basically knows that unless he comes, it doesn't mean anything, because he is the real representative of the tribe. Not because he was appointed, not because he said I'm the representative of the tribe, not because he was elected, because he just was. It was a matter of fact. So he insisted that they should go and they'd get Jabir, and Jabir should come and give the bay'ah. So Jabir was upset about this, because he didn't want to give bay'ah to Yazid. And so he went and he consulted Salama, radiallahu anha, Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, who was still alive at the time of this calamity. And he asked her what he should do, and she said that, إِنِّي أَعْلَمُ أَنَّهَا بَيْعَةُ ضَلَالَةٍ. I know that this is a bay'ah of misguidance. It's a false bay'ah. It's not a true bay'ah. But I've already advised, she mentioned some of her own kith and kin, to go and give bay'ah. Meaning, this is now a necessity. We need to do this to protect life and property of the people of Medina. We need to do this. And so she advised him to go and give the bay'ah. And so he went on behalf of Banu Salman and gave the bay'ah, because there was an understanding that this was the structure of the society. So, maybe this idea of Ahlul Halli wal Aqd in this type of society, it makes perfect sense that this is sort of the natural makeup of the society. These people actually are the ones who represent the community. What does that mean today? If I were to go to one of the Muslim countries today, after considerable degree of urbanization has taken place, not everyone has the strong tribal ties like before. Who represents who? Who is the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd? Is there some sort of alternative to this notion of Bay'ah of Ahlul Halli wal Aqd? How would this work? Even bigger questions come up with, if you're calling for a khilafah, and again, some of them insist on a very rigid understanding of this vision of calling for khilafah, meaning that the khilafah would be a super state with one khalifa who is chosen by the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd or something or another. And you honestly have to ask, well, quite frankly, if we look at the Muslim world today, we have the situation that you've described, all the legal codes, everything, the ethos of the states that exist are very much far removed from the Sharia, far removed from Islamic guidance, the structures, the institutions, the value systems that are taught in schools, very much removed from Islamic teachings and values in many respects, at least, if not all. But in many respects, with all of this, you have this situation that exists, and you have this serious challenge in front of you if you want to work towards making the Sharia central once again. And obviously, we need to work towards that, establishing the Sharia. And obviously, political unity for the Muslim world is a desirable goal. But if the Muslim world is now largely a collection of banana republics, if it was somehow possible tomorrow to just magically unite all of them and create like one giant banana empire, is that even like a meaningful goal? What exactly is your project? If you're going to take these classical rulings and say this is what we need to apply, what exactly is it that you're trying to apply? So this is another example of an area where you have a big challenge that requires serious answers. A lot of people, for example, they object to having elections. One of their objections, which I think you can understand where this is coming from, is that, well, if you have elections, you're basically, what you're doing is you're putting the Sharia up to vote. That maybe I want Sharia, maybe I don't. As a Muslim, you don't have a choice in that. If you're a Muslim, you believe in the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe there's scope for interpreting the revelation, but as a Muslim, you have to believe in it. So how can you have votes on these things? So there's this objection, and some of them say that even that whatever political structures exist, which obviously varies drastically from Muslim country to Muslim country, that maybe we shouldn't even be participating in them. But then the question is, well, what is your vision? If you're going to have, tomorrow someone comes to power somehow or another, and you try and establish your vision of the Khilafah or of Sharia rule from top down, what's the guarantee that if you could come to power by whatever means you chose to come to power, that someone can't turn around and do the same? What is the guarantee that this top down measures that you're going to take then become lasting? It raises serious questions about sort of what is our political philosophy, that this needs serious development. And that also, I think, speaks very much to what we alluded to earlier about, well, people have now, as you said, they've basically not just gone beyond the madhahib, they've gone beyond the sharia. And so the question is, as we attempt as Muslims to try and bring people back to Islamic teachings and to reestablish the authority of the revelation, the authority of the Sharia, institution in terms of on a state level, on a judiciary level, in terms of other institutions, how will that work and what will that look like? That's a huge question. And obviously, I don't think we're going to be able to answer that question in the sitting. And I don't think it's possible to answer it in any number of sittings. I think there's probably a lot of work that needs to be done, both work on the ground as well as intellectual work that needs to be done to answer those questions. But clearly, with all of this change that has happened, however that pans out, it could actually vary greatly from country to country. Each country has its own sort of unique political situation. So it would not be surprising then to see that the way that answers to this problem develop could vary greatly from place to place. And what is the role of the madhahib in that? Even the role of the madhahib could vary greatly from place to place. Meaning, for example, you have certain societies that are very much, traditionally have been very exclusively affiliated with a particular madhab. So you have, for example, in North Africa, certain places that are almost entirely Maliki. Obviously, in the subcontinent, you have much of the Muslim community of the subcontinent is almost exclusively Hanafi. Other places might have other associations, and then you also have certain societies in which you find there's more of a presence of more than one madhab. So in traditionally Maliki countries, the Maliki madhab might play a more central role in whatever sort of reform, whatever sort of development happens. In a traditionally Hanafi area, you might have more of a Hanafi background and Hanafi emphasis, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, even with this, you go to a place like the subcontinent. Well, if you speak English, which educated people in the subcontinent oftentimes do, you have access to all sorts of stuff. So people are changing madhabs, for example, or obviously you have cases of some groups that go outside of madhabs. Even locally, you have already, you have the al-Hadith, you have Jamaat Islami, who perhaps they are not necessarily as clear in the sort of madhab affiliation. So you have these things already exist, and you also have to consider just take a moment to reflect on the fact that we live in a time when just in the last few years, the number of people who believe in the flat Earth is rising. And I'm not talking about funny people, like I'm not talking about in Islamic circles. Globally, Muslims, non-Muslims, people are actually looking at this and reading these websites and becoming convinced that there's a conspiracy to hide from us that the Earth isn't actually flat, and it's actually flat, and there's all this evidence that it's flat, and so in such an environment, it's not a surprise then that as wide open as things are, and as we already have seen, you have the rise of movements who are basically abusing the idea of ijtihad, or abusing the idea of returning back to the sources and coming up with all kinds of crazy stuff. It's not surprising then that in that environment that you might also have people saying, you know what, I'm from a traditionally Hanafi place, but I feel an affinity to the Maliki Madhab or the Shafi'i Madhab or the Hanbali Madhab. I'm traditionally from a Maliki background, but I feel more of an affinity for this, and so you'll have, I think, in the future, more diversity on the ground. Anyways, obviously, that diversity will be tempered by the fact that in the subcontinent, for example, you have a lot of institutions, madaris, that are producing Hanafi ulama. Building institutions is not as easy as building websites, quite frankly. So perhaps the focus will stay. The focus might stay, but you will find yourself having a more diverse situation on the ground. I think that's something that is inevitable. That's something that is inevitable. So even this idea of having single madhab societies, I don't think that necessarily that will go away altogether. But at the same time, it's simply not going to be possible for it to stay as monolithic as it has been. And one of the reasons I say that is that this sort of attempt to maintain the monopoly is one of the things that leads people to say, okay, well, if there's no other alternative, then I'm gonna join these guys who are hadith skeptics, or these guys who are mujtahid mutlaqs, and these guys who are.
That's the point, because why do we have to wait as a within the Muslim scholarly institutions for things to get so bad that people are on the verge of ridda for us to change? I mean, couldn't we anticipate changes that are about to happen in 50 years, in 70 years, even in 20 or 10 years, given the astronomical pace of events that are happening, not only in the technological field, but also in the political arena, in the, we live in a highly unpredictable world. So how do we foster a sense of, okay, scholars need to understand that the world is not moving at a pace which they have traditionally been moving at? I mean, scholars have understood that fiqh change as time changes, but they haven't understood the, I would assume, on an institutional level, how fast things are changing at the time. And is that a byproduct of scholars compartmentalizing themselves away from the world? So you have scholars who are just religious scholars and no experience whatsoever in the corporate world, in the secular legal world, in the technological world. And is that also a reason, this is the second part of my question, is that also a reason why certain scholars have proposed that we develop a fiqh that is not based necessarily on madhahib, but on what the needs of the Muslims are at the time? And the names that come to mind here, which we discuss in the course participants will be acutely familiar with this. Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, which Ashraf Ali Thanwi asked him directly that, do we need a fiqh that should be catered for the needs of the people at the time in those limited issues where people, and he's talking about the subcontinent context under British colonial rule, but I think it's universally applicable. Do we need a fiqh which caters to the needs of the common Muslims that may not necessarily abide by the Hanafi madhab, but would simply take the easiest position from whichever madhab that is available in order for Muslims to live their lives and move on? Another name that comes to mind is Badruddin al-Halabi in his Ta'lim al-Irshad. Admittedly, he was one of the, I think, contemporaries of Rashid Rida or Muhammad Abdu, I forget. But in his Ta'lim al-Irshad, he said that he went a step further and he said, we need a unified fiqh. And he's not saying this in a Salafi sense, that we need a unified fiqh based on the dalil. He said, we need a unified fiqh that would allow Muslims, that would cater for Muslims to act upon whatever's easy across the body of Muslim legal writing. And another scholar who's made the same proposal is Muhammad Sayyid al-Albani, or the Syrian scholar, not Nasiruddin al-Albani, Muhammad Sayyid al-Albani. He said in his Umdatul Tahqiq that we need a fiqh that is based on rukhas. He said it outright. So why aren't more scholars proposing this, given the type of changes we are seeing in the world? Is this something that is viable? Is this a fiqh project that scholars need to seriously consider? Because it's only been said at a theoretical level. There hasn't really been any fiqh work produced, in my knowledge, that simply gathers the fiqh opinions that would simply, you know, I mean, we've seen a degree of that in Islamic finance.
I mean, I don't want to mention any names, but I think there are certain individuals who perhaps would be accused of, rightly or wrongly, of having done something along those lines, of basically picking out the easiest opinions on matters. And it brings up sort of two issues, at least in my mind. One is, I think that in the last century plus, that there is a dilemma that the shortcoming of scholars in responding to pressing issues has exacerbated certain problems. This is one element of this discussion. Another is that I do think that taking into account need, particularly things that are sort of a general need on a social level, sometimes just in picking one fatwa over another, when you have a choice of different opinions across madhab, I think that is one element of it. But but I think that this approach of making this sort of the guiding principle for fiqh, I think it needs to be one of the guiding principles of fiqh, is that that when hardship is created, that this merits creating ease. When or finding a different opinion that is more practical and easy. But that's just one element of fiqh. That's just one element of fiqh. I mean, like, for example, this issue that we discussed about, what is a political vision for the future. It has nothing to do with, well, what's easier or what's harder. It's do we have a vision or not? I think in terms of what we talked about as sometimes with financial issues. With financial issues, I can see how certain times, on a case-by-case basis or on the level of individual fatwa, that you can look at people's situation and say, look, of the available options, this is the best option. This is the option that basically will make things easy for you and alleviate this particular hardship that is being created. But then at the end of the day, what we're still talking about, is talfiq, talfiq really in taqlid rather than ijtihad. And so we end up still stuck in this place where we're not really developing a vision for what a modern economy should look like in light of the teachings of the Sharia. We're just cobbling together, sort of via talfiq, something that works and may not even, irrespective of how ideal it is. And so, I mean, I think a lot of certainly this is an accusation that is oftentimes made, that a lot of Islamic finance and Islamic banking and these things, that's really all that it is. It's just talfiq, it's just heel, to make something that sort of works, because this is where we are at right now. So the answer to that question is that yes, ease, accounting for hardship, is a very important element of any serious ijtihad that any mujtahid makes. You should take those things into account, but it's not the only one. And so I'm worried. I'm worried that this type of approach, it could be. I mean, it might be fine dealing with individual issues, but in terms of creating an entirely new framework, in terms of rewriting the legal codes of these Muslim countries that are basically that have taken their laws from Great Britain and France and these other places, you know, I think it's sort of you know, the man who has a hammer sees every problem as a nail. It's sort of that approach to fixing legal problems. The hammer is an important tool, but you need to have a full toolbox, and the full toolbox is the tools of Ijtihad. Do you want to, let's try and shift towards taking questions, because it's been 2 hours now. We have a lot of questions, and I don't think we're ever going to actually finish with this.
Right, let's start from the top. Okay, Brother Tariq Ali. Right. So it's so he says saying Abu Hanifa wasn't aware of opposing evidence is an assumption that has to be proved, not assumed. Al-Shaybani said Abu Hanifa was aware of all the ahadith in the Muwatta. Next one.
I mean, let me just briefly comment on this.
Paragraphs though.
Right.
So
right.
So he says Malik placed a hadith in his book that went against his madhab, and when asked why he said so, that the ignorant won't say that he wasn't aware of the hadith. Yeah. It's one thing to say they built upon those that came before them is fair and pretty obvious, but to say they weren't aware of opposing evidence is a great assumption. Sounds like the Salafi argument the hadith didn't reach him.
Okay, you know, this actually brings up an interesting sort of point. I'm not sure what he's saying here, that Shaybani said that Abu Hanifa was aware of all the hadith in Muwatta. I'm pretty sure that he's gotten his facts mixed up here. I mean, it's true that there is this notion that was popularized by contemporary Salafis that, you know, anytime they go against one of the Imams, they just assume that it's because he didn't know the hadith. And obviously, there's a lot more to fiqh than just, you know, who has the most hadith. But at the same time, and again, I think for the point that we were making in the talk, I don't think it's really that material, whether it's about Abu Hanifa or Malik or about one of the Sahaba or one of the Tabi'een. The reality is that the tadween of hadith was a gradual process. Abu Hanifa was working largely from a Kufan Iraqi corpus, also infused with things that he picked up from his rihla to the Hijaz. And Malik was working almost entirely with the Hijazi corpus, and very little with any Iraqi hadiths. He does have a few Iraqi hadiths, but not much. And even it's reported from Imam Shafi'i. Al-Bayhaqi actually quotes him on this. And he says that this was his view in an earlier stage in his life. He basically retracted this. That you know, his earlier view was that he would not accept any hadiths from Iraq that don't have supporting narrations in the Hijaz, and that this has to do with certain historical factors about how his hadith criticism developed. And so for the Hijazis, it's natural that, you know, they would not be have expertise on, you know, the reliability of Iraqi hadiths, and vice versa. Even there's a quote from Abu Yusuf himself in Ar-Radd ala Sir al-Awza'i, actually speaks to this issue of proliferation of hadith in his time, so that, you know, these hadiths are proliferating, and so stick hadiths that were not well known or proliferating. So stick to the hadiths that were well known to the fuqaha, and, you know, basically in the context he's speaking is hadiths that were not in circulation and well accepted by his fuqaha. So, you know, clearly there was a development that took place. This doesn't mean that you know, that therefore that, you know, the fiqh of Abu Hanifa or the fiqh of Malik or a Shafi'i, because a Shafi'i didn't encompass all of the hadith either, doesn't mean that there's a deficiency in their fiqh. Because On the one hand, sure, they might not have known some hadiths, which means that they would not have been aware of all of the evidences that could possibly be adduced on an issue. But at the same time, in large part, the usul of the ahkam, the Prophet ﷺ conveyed them, and so people would have been aware of them. So it's not as if we're saying that, that part of the deen was lost and Abu Hanifa didn't know it, or that Malik didn't know it, or Umar didn't know it. But yes, Umar didn't know some hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. Az-Zuhri, who was the most knowledgeable person of hadith in his time, didn't know some of the hadiths. He hadn't encompassed all of the hadith. Because the process of tadween and gathering the hadith, it was something that happened, was sort of a general effort of generations. So I mean, I can understand why some people would be concerned by this sort of statement, but this is not something that is belittling these imams. Scholarship was a cumulative process. Now, as for a particular issue, claiming that Abu Hanifa must not have known this hadith or Malik must not have known this hadith, we didn't actually make any specific claims like that. So.
Yeah, we didn't make specific claims. The point that was made was that in the case of Imam Abu Hanifa, for example, or Imam Malik, before the hadith was circulated across the Amsar, before it was simply regional hadith. So you had the Kufan hadith, Basri hadith, Makkan hadith, Asanid Musalsala bil Madaniyin, etc., etc. So in Kufa, they would have typically been largely unfamiliar with the ahadith, the particular ahadith that were related in, for example, the Hijaz. Yeah. So the question I was proposing is, in the case of those specific ahadith where a mujtahid in Iraq would be unfamiliar with or hasn't come across, and he has an opinion in that issue, and his ijtihad is limited to the ahadith which are in Kufa or which are in Basra, would we categorize that scholarly endeavor as ijtihad? Because he hasn't fully assessed what's on the other side. Even though he might be familiar that they might have another opinion, but he might not be familiar with the specific, detailed, granular on a granular level ahadith that are in circulation in Hijaz. So would you classify that as ijtihad, a proper ijtihad? Because ijtihad entails, the question is, ijtihad entails that you know your evidence and you know the evidences on the other side, which in this case, the mujtahid like Abu Hanifa would be acutely familiar with the ahadith within Kufa or Iraq, but wouldn't be as familiar that are in circulation in the Hijaz. Or would we categorize Imam Abu Hanifa's scholarly endeavor as taqlid as simply following what was passed down within the Kufan tradition? Now, one specific example I can give is the issue of nabid. Are we going to say that the permissibility of the consumption of nabid is a position that was arrived at by all the scholars of Kufa independent of one another? Do you understand what I'm saying? In the sense that everybody outside of Kufa or everybody outside of Iraq arrived at the conclusion that nabid is haram, and everyone or most of the scholars within Iraq arrived at the conclusion, or in Kufa at least, arrived at the conclusion that the nabid is halal independently via their own personal ijtihad. That would be a huge coincidence.
Particularly if we're assuming that all of them have the same evidences,
yeah,
and the same knowledge concerning those evidences and their reliability as in terms of hadith evidences, and are all examining them independently, and then subhanAllah, the Kufans just happen to all reach the same conclusion, and this happened to be in Kufa.
That's a coincidence that one simply cannot assert. So one would have to assume that there is a level of, you can say taqlid, but you can simply say there was a level of following the tradition that was in vogue in Kufa. So Imam Abu Hanifa and Sufyan al-Thawri and Ibn Abi Layla, they were all part of that Kufan tradition, where they would simply say that nabid is halal, and this is the evidence they were that they were aware of.
Yeah, and I don't think it's realistic to assume that any scholar at any point says, you know what, I'm going to spend the next 20 years, I'm just going to go through all of the abwab of fiqh, starting with tahara, issue number 1, issue number 2, issue number 3, and re-examine everything. And until then, I don't have an opinion.
Yeah, that's a popular of Ijtihad, and it doesn't mean directly to the Quran and Sunnah all the time. No.
So you know, so it comes back to what we said, that inevitably scholarship is cumulative. You build on what you learn from your teachers. You build on what scholars have done in the past, and that applies even to the Mujtahid Imams. And so that's simply the nature of Ijtihad. Ijtihad will always be, you know, building on all of this scholarship. Okay, I will.
Two more examples on it. If the issue of Abu Yusuf visiting Medina with the Khalifa at the time after Abu Hanifa passed away, and the issue of the sa' came up, and what's the exact measurement? And he retorted, the children of Medina came with their aswa', that if my sahib, meaning Abu Hanifa, was alive around to see this, he would have changed his opinion on the exact measurement of the sa'. So it's not only about a hadith, it's about inherited traditions. That's one. And the other is Imam al-Shafi'i, even though he was a fiqh teacher of Imam Ahmad, he's asking Imam Ahmad, if you know of any hadith which I don't know, whether it's Basri or Kufi or Shami, let me know so I can incorporate that into my fiqh, which clearly shows that in spite of being a mujtahid, a Shafi'i, he still acknowledged the fact that he might be unfamiliar with certain hadith which Imam Ahmad had, because Imam Ahmad, being the muhaddith, even though he was his junior and student, Shafi is asking Ahmad that if there's any hadith that I don't know, let me know.
Right, and that's interesting, because I mentioned earlier about how al-Bayhaqi had quoted a Shafi'i saying that he would, in his earlier stage, he was skeptical of Iraqi hadiths. He actually mentions in that context this quote where he says to Imam Ahmad what you just mentioned, and basically, if I recall correctly, his explanation is that basically when he came to realize that the Ashab al-Hadith had done a sufficient job of sort of critiquing these hadiths, and he could rely on them for their knowledge of what was authentic and what was not. That was when he changed his approach to dealing with Iraqi hadiths. Not that he felt that Iraqi hadiths are inherently, they're just so bad that this can't be used. But again, hadith criticism was an area of scholarship that also had very human elements in its development.
Yeah.
Next question.
Okay, we have the ulama who are qualified to be mujtahid, but I assume the brother or sister is, but is it required to give an opinion on a social matter about which they have no expertise? What is it that can be done?
All right, I think what she means is someone is qualified to speak about fiqh, but is being asked to give a fatwa on a social matter on which he has no practical expertise. What can be done? I mean, I think that the simple answer to that question is that either he needs to refer to someone who has, he himself needs to refer to someone who has combines the knowledge of these two areas to consult him in giving an answer, or at the very least, you know, such a scholar would, in such a position, needs to actually consult with those who are capable of giving him a good picture of the situation, people who are actual experts who can give him a good idea of what is this issue that he's dealing with, so that he can make a proper assessment of it in light of the Sharia. Anything like that?
No, but basically what is needed nowadays is scholars who have studied in the religious disciplines to go ahead and study in the secular disciplines, so we have a perspective on both. So we can't afford to have scholars who are simply graduates in the religious disciplines. We need scholars who are multi-specialists.
Right. I think in terms of fiqh training for the future, there needs to be a look at bringing sort of new tools into the toolkit of the mujtahid or the faqih, and some of those tools would include some of the social sciences.
What was the title of Suyuti's book? It's called Jazilul Mawahib في اختلاف المذاهب. So it's sectioned out into 3 sections, I believe. The first section is whether every opinion is correct in the eyes of Allah or not, I think. And the second section is about whether you have to stick to a madhab or not, which he says no. And the third section is about scholars changing madhab. A more comprehensive work is by Bakr Abu Zayd, the late Saudi scholar. He has a book called At-Tahawwul al-Madhabi. So he incorporates whatever Suyuti said and adds additional cases of scholars switching madhab for both religious and non-religious purposes. Right. Sheikh Khalid al-Haq al-Amin, assalamu alaikum. How are you? How representative are usul or maqasid books of actual ijtihad? How representative are usul or maqasid books of actual ijtihad when they were written centuries after the fact?
And obviously, it's not just in the Hanafi madhab. You have generally the usul literature across madhab was written after the madhab were already fairly developed. So you have this dilemma of usul is a tool for ijtihad, but it's being written by people who are, to a considerable extent, muqallids. And so it does create a dilemma that if some of the theoretical discussions in the usul fiqh books, there are gaps in the theory that the writer doesn't really recognize because he's not a practitioner of ijtihad per se. And so he doesn't appreciate some of the problems with what he's discussing. And I think I mentioned an example of this last week with ijma', that that the way that ijma' is conceptualized in not in all usul fiqh books, but in many usul fiqh books, some of the shurut of ijma', the way that they're conceptualized, I think it does reflect a lack of sufficient rigor in conceptualizing the ijma' and its shurut. And part of the reason for that lack of rigor is because of the lack of practical application in this respect. And so that would apply to various mabahith in usul fiqh and various mabahith in books of Maqasid al-Sharia that were written by Shatibi. I mean, Shatibi is an interesting example. Shatibi writes this entire book on Maqasid al-Sharia, yet at the same time, Shatibi is very much an advocate of extreme caution when it comes to doing ijtihad, and of following actually the mashhur of the Maliki madhab, and saying about himself that he's not qualified for ijtihad. And so, he didn't write about Maqasid al-Sharia so much for Mujtahids to pick up his book and start doing ijtihad on their basis. He did it to try and explain what he felt the earlier Mujtahid Imams were actually doing. But again, since he's not a practitioner, some of his ideas, we will have to carefully critique them to see, well, how sound is this? So in that respect, in that respect, it's not what later scholars of Usul al-Fiqh have written is not necessarily above critique.
Yeah. Ash-Shatibi, on the specific point of Ash-Shatibi, his methodology of Ijtihad and Taqlid, and having to follow the mashhur or the rajih or the muqallid, even having to do tarjih between scholars, because he wrote al-Muwafaqat fi Sharia, a lot of people have become overly impressed by what he wrote. The fact of the matter is, he was simply disagreeing with one of his teachers in Andalus by the name of Abu Sa'id ibn Lub. Abu Sa'id ibn Lub al-Maliki, he had a more liberal approach to fiqh and taqlid, especially taqlid for muqallids. So if you read his fatwa, which are published and are available online, he has a far more liberal approach and relaxed approach to following opinions than Ash-Shatibi did. So Ash-Shatibi was in some of his works where he talks about the necessity to do this, to do it in this regimented, rigid approach. Muqallid must do tarjih between scholars. You must follow the mashhur. It's basically a refutation on his teacher Abu Sa'id ibn Lub. So that's the background to Ash-Shatibi, a bit of background to Ash-Shatibi, which is important to know because he's not speaking in a vacuum. Ash-Shatibi wasn't impressed with his teacher's methodology, but on a personal note, I think Ibn Lub is far more suited. His views, his methodological views, are far more suited for today's era than those of Ash-Shatibi. Wallahu
alam. Carry on, Sheikh Khalid.
Yeah, so he says in the intro to Al-Fiqh al-Islami, Sheikh Wahab al-Zuhaili says we may need to refer to the madhahib of the Shia to solve modern problems. Do you agree? The fiqh of Ja'far al-Sadiq, and a similar case can be made for the ahadith of Ja'far al-Sadiq. What do you think about that? And why are the ahadith of Ja'far al-Sadiq largely not present in the books of the Ahlul Sunnah, the ahadith books? What's the background?
Well, I mean, Ja'far al-Sadiq is... That's not entirely true. I mean, Ja'far is a narrator in the Sahihain. He's a narrator in the Muwatta of Malik. Sorry, Ja'far, or is it his father? I think, if I'm not mistaken, Malik, the famous hadith of Jabir in Hajj. There's the hadith of Jabir in Hajj. It's a long hadith where it describes the whole Hajj of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's very important because it's so detailed. Concerning Hajj, it's one of the most important hadiths that there is. It's reported by Malik in his Muwatta via Ja'far. So this is not something to make light of. Ja'far, this hadith is actually, it's a very pivotal hadith for the fiqh of Hajj. So there you have it. Ja'far is actually present in our fiqh of Hajj. The dilemma that comes up with the madhahib of the Shia is in terms of its attribution of opinions to their imams, to their imams who are also imams for us, people like Ja'far al-Sadiq and al-Baqir. There are serious questions about the reliability, both the hadiths that they report, as well as the fiqh that they attribute to them. Obviously, I think the hadith issue is probably already well known. You probably find a lot of material about it, about issues with hadith narration. But you know, with the attribution of fiqh opinions as well, there is a dilemma. And there was an issue with these pivotal figures of Ahlul Bayt, particularly in the early generations, both in Umayyad times and in the Abbasid times, that there was an effort to ensure that they don't become prominent and develop large followings, because there were also instances where leading figures from the Ahlul Bayt, whether from the line of Al-Hasan or Al-Hussein, would sometimes revolt, right? And so there was actually an interest in ensuring that they're not able to develop a significant following and a significant public profile. That that is one of the reasons why this was not highlighted so much. But to speak to this particular question, I'm not really going to answer this question. What I'll say is this. It comes back to what are the shurut of ijma'. If you're going to say that their khilaf is valid, incidentally, you'll find there are discussions in the books of Usul al-Fiqh that the khilaf of the mubtadi', as long as he's a mujtahid, is a valid khilaf. This shart is in of itself مختلف فيها. Some of them say that no, the mubtada his khilaf is not valid. But then, that also raises another, sort of opens another can of worms. If you say that, you then have all the Sunnis who are declaring each other mubtada. And so where are you going to draw the line? But that's something that would have, that has to be made tahrir of, in terms of when can an opinion, an ijtihad, be considered valid ijtihad, and when not. And so my answer to that question, my personal answer to that question, would be it depends. I would be skeptical of issues that are coming from Shia fiqh, but I wouldn't say as an absolute answer that all of it is invalid. Ijtihad, and therefore of no itibar. And incidentally, this is one of the arguments that Ibn Taymiyyah uses against Subki in his rebuttal of his response to Subki's rebuttal of him on his views on talaq. He argues that that as long as they're mujtahid, then their qawl is valid, and it has to be taken into consideration with regards to ijma and ikhtilaf.
I had the opportunity to study Shi'i ilm al-fara'id at SOAS. So they have a slightly different model to inheritance than Sunnis do. And from a secular perspective, their model might seem more equitable than that of the Sunnis, from a secular perspective.
You mean in certain issues they
so for example, if there's three sons and one son dies before the father, so when the father dies, his grandchildren from the third son who died, they would inherit as well. The two sons wouldn't block the grandsons. So and examples like that make their model of inheritance, from a secular perspective, I must stress, from a secular perspective, more equitable.
Right, and it's funny you mentioned that issue. I actually remember one of the courses that I did with in al-Qura University. Our teacher was someone who actually works in the judicial system, basically, let's say. And so on inheritance cases where you have sometimes someone is here in Saudi Arabia, but some of their relatives are outside, and so their inheritance is being divided up. Rulings that are coming from courts outside from other places in the Muslim world get reviewed when the rulings are being implemented here. And so he was in, I believe it was I think his official position is I think actually it's a position in Diwan al-Mabadi. But he said that once he was reviewing a case that came from Jordan, where they were dividing up the heirs, and basically they were doing it in light of the Jordanian legal code. And so they said that that basically they'd made the grandchildren of a son in just this sort of scenario, they named him as one of the heirs. I was like, how in the world is this guy a waris? And so he said he investigated to see where in the world they're taking this from. Is this a Poland or the Madhab? And so I think what he found was that they had done some sort of talfiq. This is what I recall from memory, what he said. They did some sort of talfiq where they said that this is an ijtihad of Ibn Hazm, that you can make a wasiyah like this. So they took this and then they made that wasiyah, the idea of doing wasiyah in this situation, they made it lazim. And they made that the legal code. Because they decided that, that this kid needs to get his share. And irrespective of whether or not the ijtihad in this particular issue is valid or invalid, I mean, that would be something for an actual mujtahid to actually properly sit down and look at. And I'm not going to make a judgment here off the top of my head. But again, maybe maybe if it can be found that there was ikhtilaf on this, that maybe it merits examination, and maybe there are circumstances in which this particular ruling merits application. But basically, this professor, not a professor, he's actually teaching these courses for the Qadha department on the side. He mainly works in his judicial capacity. But he said that when he investigated the issue and he found out this is what it was, he wrote that this is an invalid ruling. It's not based on any method. So he basically rejected it. That that we're not going to implement this ruling for you in this fashion because it's going against the Sharia. Or at the very least, it's about the quote. Okay, so Arman asks, what is the relationship between popularity and an ijtihad being accepted by Muslims across the world? I'm not sure what that question means.
If you're popular, then it's more likely your opinion would be accepted by the masses as opposed to if you're an unknown person.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth to that. So I guess we need to try and get people who are qualified Mujtahids to be popular. We need to promote their work so that the masses come to also recognize them as people who are scholars that should be actually referred to for their ijtihad on pressing contemporary issues, as opposed to other people who sometimes are very famous and are not very qualified.
Right.
I mean, a particular fatwa about strawberries is coming to mind. But okay, so another question from Sheikh Khalid.
Okay, should not. Go on.
Yeah. Should not modern ijtihad include knowledge of modern processes, e.g., what nullifies fast by reaching stomach and brain? I mean, I think clearly this is something that that science, where you have rulings that are dependent on knowledge of anatomy or knowledge of certain scientific facts that were made by classical scholars. Again, this is another area where ijtihad would be needed. So this is an example of an issue related to fasting. You also have a number of issues related to haid, to menstruation. Obviously, modern medicine knows a lot more about women's menstrual cycles, and the modern medical establishment has gathered a lot more data about women's menstrual cycles and their patterns and things like that than what the classical fuqaha had. So it is something that there are a host of issues actually in books of fiqh that need to be revised or could be revised in this fashion. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these. Are these discussions on ijtihad taking place in the Muslim world? If so, what have been the practical impact of the discussions? If not, how can the conversation begin? You want to take a whack at that?
Yeah, we alluded to this earlier on. There is a discussion on ijtihad taking place. Unfortunately, that discussion has been drowned out by the noise on following madhabs, following the mu'tamad, or even following the dalil in some cases in a Salafi context. But qualified ijtihad is a necessity, and there have been numerous papers written on it for decades, since the 50s and 60s at least. And it is ijtihad upon which, it is a principle of ijtihad upon which the majami fiqhiyya have been founded across the world. So even though the majami fiqhiyya have their own problems, so for example, absence of scholars attending when they were supposed to attend, or influence by the host government into the majma' fiqhi, or for example, their conclusions not being adequately published or disseminated across the world through the various mediums that are there, or indeed, if their qararat, their conclusions, not being woven into the fabric of fiqh that is taught to students in universities and jami'at and darul ulooms. Notwithstanding all those problems, what they're doing in the majami fiqhiyya is ijtihad.
Yeah. Which brings us to this question: can ijtihad be institutionalized? I mean, I think clearly one form of institutionalization of ijtihad is the majami fiqhiyya. You have some of these are government bodies as well. Sometimes, in some cases, you have government bodies who their actual task is to actually answer questions that are put to it by the state itself. Sometimes, so there is some degree of institutionalization that is taking place. Obviously, traditionally, we had institutions that regulated ijtihad. Those were the four madhabs with the hierarchy and attached institutions, madaris, judiciary, the literature that would then be produced by these scholars that sort of served that function classically. And the framework that existed for that obviously doesn't exist anymore, or at least big chunks of it are missing. And so it does raise a question of for the future, there is a need to develop some sort of institutional frameworks for that. Even one day, even at the state level, there will be a need for developing more robust institutions that are capable of actually providing some sort of authority, at the very least in judicial issues, which what shape will that take is yet to be seen. I mean, we're still at the very beginning of these sorts of discussions. Okay. To what extent should knowing the law of non-Muslim societies impact the way scholars from these societies make ijtihad? I mean, I think definitely if it's something that is impactful on the social circumstances or contracts that you're making a ruling on, clearly you have to have a background on those things. Ahmed Ala asked, we need a course on the historical development of each madhab and how they became prominent. Yes, we do, and Sheikh Salman Yunus is currently doing an excellent course on the history of the Hanafi madhab. I don't think anyone is going to be able to top him. I've been attending that course. He's doing an excellent job. Courses like this would be excellent on the other madhab as well, and hopefully Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives someone tawfiq to do that. I'm personally planning on doing a short lecture series on the history of fiqh at sometime in the future that will not be focused on a particular madhab, but to give sort of an analytical framework to understand the historical development of fiqh as it is pertinent to the discussions that we're having. So hopefully that can be a useful contribution in that area as well. Okay, I'll just come to the last two questions. We'll take these and then we'll call it a night. Okay, Ahmed Ala is asking also, how much realistically can be achieved by scholars on national levels? Ulama were prominent in the establishment of Pakistan, yet ignored in the development of Pakistan constitution or judiciary. Ismail, can I take a crack at it?
I don't have an answer.
Yeah. So it brings up an interesting issue. Ulama sometimes were prominent in Pakistan and also in other places in the independence movements, and then largely sidelined afterwards. And I think we need to actually try and understand better why that happened in these different places, so that we can have a better idea of how Islamic scholarship can be more effective on the ground, politically and on the grassroots level, in terms of shaping our societies moving forward. I don't think that really answers the question, but that's the answer.
I would add to that, ulama need to be more savvy nowadays than they have been before traditionally. Not only in Pakistan, but we've seen cases of that in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. I mean, the moment the royal decree came for the legitimization of women driving in Saudi Arabia, their credibility was smashed. And that was, yani, what can I say? And then you had on the very next day, you have ulama doing U-turns so publicly as if they've never said anything else before. It was an embarrassment. That, I mean, if they would have remained silent.
But the very next day, you had women doing U-turns because they weren't allowed to make U-turns before. They weren't allowed to drive.
If they would have remained silent, that would have been better, the ulama. But
yeah, I mean, it was definitely the way that it was done. It definitely it damaged the reputation of the ulama as a class in Saudi Arabia, which I mean, to some extent, you have to consider how much of that is their fault and how much of that is yeah, I guess that's really all you have to consider, how much of that is their fault, and what can be done now to repair that damage, and from a number of angles. I don't just mean by recreating that, by recreating the trust, but also by addressing the problems that led to the loss of that trust. Actually, two more. Do you think there should be a synthesized system of fiqh such that if even one scholar out of the 4 imams says something is haram, then the overall hukum is that it's impermissible?
I would reframe that question and say, if one of the 4 imams said it's halal, then the hukum would be it's permissible. Because we as an ummah cannot afford to place more rigidities and barriers in how we deal with the Sharia of Allah Azza wa Jal. I mean, that is not the way forward at all. I mean,
I mean, I think what this commenter suggested is possibly it's something that maybe on an individual level, it's praiseworthy for individuals to practice wara by leaving off things that are doubtful in issues of ikhtilaf, where they feel that the ikhtilaf is strong, and so they choose to exercise wara. But I mean, that certainly that cannot be made a model that is sort of obligatory or binding or even recommended for the masses, because that is inevitably, it's a recipe for an incredible amount of hardship, and that's not the purpose of the Sharia. Anything you want to add before moving on to the last one? Yep.
We can't maintain 2 Sharias in the sense that we have a ihtiyat and wara' model, and then we have a mass consumption model of fiqh where people are allowed to take lenient positions. I mean, even if you want to practice on the more cautious position, you don't need to publicize it.
Yeah.
And especially if you're a scholar who has some degree of influence in society, don't publicize it. There's absolutely
I mean, making wara the basis of fatwa is a very slippery slope to creating all kinds of hardship for people. And so where you might be thinking in the short run that you're protecting people's deen, you're actually actually pushing people out the door in the long run, because it becomes undue hardship. This is our last one. I've heard it said that there is no true ijma. I can't recall where or from whom I heard this, but does such a statement have any weight? Jazakumullahu khairan. You want to answer that first? I have a comment on this, but if you want to say something.
I assume you're referring to what Imam Ahmad said, whoever claims ijma', they're lying. Dozens of
Right.
scholars commented on what he actually means. So I'm not going to delve into that right
Right.
now.
I mean, since we've mentioned ijma a couple of times, I'll just say that ijma is a very important tool in the toolkit of the mujtahid. So I strongly disagree with this statement. However, on the level of the theory of understanding ijma, what is ijma and how is ijma determined, because there is this problem that exists in the usul literature of so many different opinions, so many different shurut, it really does muddy the picture. And another element to this discussion is what is the actual basis for ijma being a binding evidence? What is the basis of its hujjiyah? The discussions in the books of usul fiqh about this, there is also a good bit of ikhtilaf. This ikhtilaf has, I think, significant ramifications. And so some scholars have actually argued that basically the only sort of ijma that is reliable is what is known as ma'lum min ad-din bit-turura, which are basically things that are sort of really outside the discussion of the fuqaha, which means that in fiqhi issues in which there might be potentially some scope for ijtihad, that those who are advocating this opinion are saying that basically ijma has no place in this discussion. And so practically then ijma basically becomes of no relevance of any sort. And I think that this is problematic. I think this view is deeply problematic. But at the same time, there are classically various scholars who have advocated that basically what is known as ijma sukuti is not a hujjah, and that and so therefore most of these sorts of ijma'at are not actually any sort of binding proof. And so you have also in our times, you have a number of scholars who have adopted this view. And this is significant in our times because in our times, the door of ijtihad, as I said, is not just open, it's broken. So the practical ramifications of this are now much more significant in our time. And so what I would say that ijma is important. Ijma is an important dalil. The arguments that these sorts of arguments that basically diminish the value of ijma as a fiqhi evidence, I think are potentially they are very problematic and potentially dangerous, because it can lead to actually undermining the transmission of the Sharia. But that's a very complicated discussion that's beyond the scope of this session. And the other thing that I would add is on the flip side as well, we have a problem that because of this lack of clarity about the theoretical basis of ijma and about its workings, you also get on the other side scholars using ijma sort of as a blunt sort of tool to bludgeon people over the head anytime they differ. And this is a problem as well. And unfortunately, this sort of misusage of ijma is actually one of the things that has led to undermining its reliance on ijma, because people have become so accustomed to saying, "Oh, everybody claims ijma." These people are claiming ijma, and there's actual difference of opinion, and so how can we rely on these claims of ijma? And so this is a problem because number one, it actually stifles real scholarly pursuit of ijtihad, and it's a problem also because it ultimately cheapens the value of ijma when people start to realize that many of these claims of ijma are not are not very strong. They're not based on scholarly rigor, and so it undermines the value of ijma. And so there's a need for a balance in the middle, and that achieving that balance requires a really sort of tackling head on the discussions about ijma and what is the mustanid of its hujjah, or what is the actual evidence for it being a hujjah, and what is the methodology for ascertaining claims of ijma. So this is an area of usul that it needs a serious scholarly discourse to hammer these issues out properly, so that ijma can take its rightful place in the framework of dealing with ijtihad and fiqh. Okay. That brings us to a conclusion. Do you have anything else?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So thank you all for attending the session. I know we've gone on very long, as we did in the previous session, but hopefully you'll all find this to be beneficial, and hopefully this is a positive step towards getting discourse going on what is the future of fiqh and the future of fiqh studies and the practice and application of fiqh and the role of ijtihad in that. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا